Adaize had been awake since 5 in the morning. Not because her alarm had gone off, not because the sun had pushed through the curtains too early, or because her cousin had been making noise in the kitchen. She had been awake because her mind would not let her rest, and her mind would not rest because today was the kind of day that had been circled on the calendar of her heart for months. Chioma's wedding, the wedding she had been personally invited to, the wedding she had helped prepare for in every quiet, behind-the-scenes way that people like Adaize always did, with genuine care, without announcement, and without once asking for credit or recognition. She lay still for a long moment after she opened her eyes, staring at the ceiling of her small but tidy room in the flat she shared with her younger cousin on the island. The ceiling had a water stain near the left corner that she had been meaning to report to the landlord for 3 months now. She noticed it every single morning and did nothing about it. That was a certain kind of woman she was, in certain areas of her life. Patient to a fault. Tolerant in ways that sometimes served her and sometimes did not. Always giving things time that perhaps deserved something more decisive. She sat up slowly and reached for her phone on the nightstand. No new messages. She checked again out of habit, scrolling past notifications from a news app she had downloaded during a period of optimism about keeping up with current events and had never meaningfully used since. Nothing from Ngozi. Nothing from Chioma. Nothing from anyone connected to the wedding. That was fine, she told herself. It was early still. People were busy. Today was a very big day for the family, and a big day meant organized chaos from before sunrise, and organized chaos meant that nobody was sitting around composing friendly morning texts to their guests. She understood that. She placed the phone back on the nightstand and got out of bed. The dress she had chosen for the wedding was hanging on the back of her wardrobe door, protected by the thin plastic wrap that the dry cleaner had placed over it 2 days before. It was a deep burgundy, not the Asoebi color. She had declined to purchase the Asoebi fabric that most of the female guests were buying. Not because she could not afford it, and not because she had any objection to the tradition. She had simply wanted to come as herself, not as part of a coordinated sea of matching fabric. And Chioma had told her that was more than perfectly fine. Chioma had said, with complete sincerity, "Come as you are, Adaize. You always look beautiful." That memory made her smile briefly as she moved to the bathroom. She had known Ngozi for 12 years. They had met in their second year of university during a group project for a sociology course that neither of them had particularly wanted to take. The assignment had required students to observe social behavior in public spaces over a set number of hours, and the two of them had ended up at a busy bus park one Wednesday afternoon, notebook in hand, watching strangers navigate their day. Adaize had approached the assignment the way she approached everything, with structure, with notes, with the quiet seriousness of someone who understood that the grade mattered. Ngozi had been seated beside her, also watching, but with a completely different energy. She had been making quiet, hilariously precise observations under her breath about the people passing by. The man who greeted 5 different people in the space of 10 minutes, each greeting slightly more enthusiastic than the last. The woman who counted her change 3 times before putting it away with absolute satisfaction, and her timing was so perfect, and her delivery so dry, that Adaize had to physically turn away from the scene to compose herself before she laughed out loud. They had walked back to campus when the hours were done, and the conversation had simply not stopped. Not that evening, not the following morning, not for 12 years afterward. Ngozi was the kind of person who commanded attention without appearing to seek it. She was tall, and moved with an unhurried confidence that people noticed before she said a word. She had a laugh that came from somewhere deep and genuine. A laugh that filled a room, not because it was the loudest sound in it, but because it was the most alive one. She remembered everything about people. The birthday of someone she had met once, the name of a person's younger sister, the fact that a colleague could not eat anything with coriander in it. She deployed these details with instinctive precision, and people adored her for it. They felt remembered. They felt significant in her presence. Adaize had felt that way too, for a very long time. She washed her face carefully, and applied her moisturizer in the way she always did, methodically, without rushing, paying attention to what she was doing. Then she sat down at her dressing table and opened her makeup. She had done it herself because she trusted her own hands. She was not particularly vain, but she was precise, and precision was what she wanted this morning. She knew exactly what she was going for. Clean, put together, nothing that would compete with a wedding dress, or seem like she was trying too hard. She was a guest. She wanted to look like a guest who respected the occasion. The wedding invitation sat at the corner of the dressing table, where it had lived for the past 3 months. It was a cream-colored envelope, a little thicker than ordinary envelopes, with Adaize's name and the event details printed in gold on the front. Chioma had pressed it into her hands herself, at a dinner at the family house in Surulere, on a warm Thursday evening, 3 months before the wedding date. Adaize had been there because Ngozi had asked her to come. They had driven together, laughing about something that had happened at work to one of Adaize's colleagues, a story she had told Ngozi in installments over the course of that week. The family dinner had been relaxed, a round table that was slightly too small for the number of people packed around it, jollof rice from a pot that Chioma's mother had cooked that afternoon, the sound of too many conversations overlapping pleasantly. Chioma had stood at some point in the meal, reached into the pocket of her blouse, and produced a handful of envelopes. She had moved around the table deliberately, calling each person's name, placing an envelope in their hands personally. When she had reached Adaize, who was, after all, not family, not blood, but a friend of Ngozi's who had been absorbed into the warmth of their gatherings over the years, she had held the envelope out with both hands. Both hands. The way you give something to someone, you want to be sure receives it properly. And she had said, "I'm so glad you were here tonight. I want you at my wedding. I really truly do." Adaize had said thank you. She had felt it in her chest, the warmth of being wanted somewhere without having had to wonder or maneuver for it. She had kept the envelope on the dressing table, rather than filing it away, or tucking it into a drawer. She liked seeing it there. It was a small, tangible reminder that she had been thought of, included, sought out. If that sounded lonelier than she meant it to sound, well, she was not a lonely woman. She had her cousin, her work, her colleagues, her routine, a handful of genuinely good people she saw regularly. But there was something about being handed something with both hands, something about the deliberateness of being named and looked in the eye, that lived longer in a person than most other things. She finished her makeup, stood up, removed the plastic from the burgundy dress, and put it on carefully. It fell just below the knee, 3/4 sleeves, a neckline that was modest without being severe, a slight flare at the hem that moved when she walked. She had found it at a boutique on the mainland 4 months ago, and she had known within 30 seconds of trying it on that it was the correct choice. She was not tall, but the dress did something generous for her proportions. She looked at herself in the wardrobe mirror for a moment. She looked exactly as she had hoped to look, ready, composed, like a woman who knew where she was going, and had dressed for the occasion with intention. She dropped her phone and the invitation into her small beaded clutch, called out to her cousin, who was, as expected, still very deeply asleep behind a closed bedroom door, to let her know she was leaving, and got no answer. She smiled, picked up her keys, locked the front door behind her, and went downstairs to find a cab. The morning was already active. The street outside the building had vendors arranging their wares, a group of schoolchildren in matching uniforms, walking in a loose formation toward wherever their Saturday lessons were held, a man on a bicycle balancing what appeared to be a truly absurd quantity of cardboard boxes while pedaling with complete serenity. The city had a particular energy on weekend mornings, a combination of people who were very busy and people who had decided firmly not to be. And the two groups moved alongside each other in a way that Adaize had always found oddly comforting. The cab took 40 minutes to reach the church. The driver had a gospel radio station on, just loud enough to fill the car with something that felt appropriate for the morning. Adaize sat in the back with her clutch in her lap and looked out the window. She was thinking about the day ahead. She was thinking about seeing Ngozi in the bridesmaid's dress, and how they would hug the way they always hugged, both arms, for a moment that was long enough to feel real, and how the slight distance she had felt between them in recent weeks would dissolve in the warmth of a face-to-face encounter the way it always had before. She had felt that distance, but she had explained it. Ngozi was busy with the wedding. Family obligations multiplied before a sibling ceremony. The stress of coordinating everything, of being expected to be in several places at once, of managing both the excitement and the demands of the people around her. Adaize understood all of that. She had given it space. She was still giving it space. She arrived at the church compound 30 minutes before the ceremony was to begin. The compound was filling rapidly. Women in the cream and gold asoebi moved in animated clusters. Photographers were already staking out positions near the entrance. An usher was directing arriving cars. The air smelled of fresh flowers from the arrangements along the path, leading to the church doors, and of the particular mix of fragrances that always accumulated when many dressed-up people occupied the same outdoor space in warm weather. Adaize made her way through the gathering crowd slowly, nodding at faces she did not know, stepping aside for a group of older women who were moving with the comfortable authority of people who had been to many weddings and had their own established rhythm for attending them. She positioned herself near a row of potted plants along the path, giving herself a clear view of the compound while she waited for the doors to open. It was there, standing near those plants, that she saw Ngozi. Ngozi was across the compound, perhaps 20 meters away. She was already in the bridesmaid's dress, a shade of dusty rose that was clearly chosen to complement the gold of the decor, and she stood with the easy confidence that was entirely her own. She was talking to someone, a woman Adaize recognized distantly, the kind of recognition that places a face without attaching a name, someone from a family gathering, years ago, a cousin, or a family friend. Adaize started to raise her hand. The natural instinct, when you spot someone you love across a crowd, is to raise your hand, to wave, to say with your arm, "I see you, I am here, I am glad to be." She did not complete the gesture, because before her hand had reached its full height, she watched Ngozi open her bag. She watched Ngozi reach inside, with the deliberate movement of a person who knows exactly where the thing they are looking for is. She watched Ngozi produce an envelope, cream-colored, slightly thick, and hold it out to the woman beside her. The woman took it. She turned it over, opened the flap, glanced at the contents. She looked up at Ngozi with a small nod. Ngozi said something back, brief and quiet. The woman folded the envelope with care and placed it into her own bag. Adaize's raised hand came back down to her side. She stood perfectly still. The sounds of the compound continued all around her. The photographer calling out directions, the laughter of a group of women nearby, the opening bars of organ music drifting through the church doors, children running between legs. Everything continued to be entirely normal for everyone in that space, except for Adaize, who was standing near a row of potted plants with a stillness that had nothing to do with relaxation. She understood what she had just seen. She reached into her clutch. Her fingers found the cream envelope immediately. She drew it out just far enough to confirm what she already knew. Her name, the gold lettering, the weight of it in her hand, the physical proof that she had been invited, that her invitation was real. She put it back. Ngozi's gaze had swept briefly in her direction after the exchange, scanning the compound in the way a person does when they are checking something. Their eyes did not meet. Whether Ngozi had not seen her, or had seen her and chosen not to show it, was a question Adaize could not answer from where she stood. Both possibilities carried weight. Neither one was comfortable. She stood there for another moment. Then she thought about the drive home, the dress back on its hanger, the day collapsing into something to be gotten through rather than experienced. The particular quiet of her flat on a Saturday morning when she was supposed to be somewhere else. She thought about both hands. She thought about her name spoken aloud, and meant. She thought, the invitation is real. The right to be here is real, whatever this means, and it means something. She was under no illusion about that. Today is not the day to unpack it. Today is Kioma's wedding. She straightened her posture. She adjusted the strap of her clutch. She turned toward the entrance of the church, kept her eyes forward, and walked through the doors alone. Nobody stopped her. Nobody questioned her. The usher near the entrance glanced at her, clutch in the way ushers do, and gestured her forward with a brief, pleasant smile. She returned the smile and kept walking. Inside, the church was high-ceilinged and cool. Large ceiling fans moved the air in slow, wide circles. White and gold fabric was draped in long folds along the walls, and the end of every pew was marked with fresh flowers, white lilies and small yellow blooms she could not name but found lovely. She chose a seat in the middle section of the church, not at the front where family would sit and where she would be conspicuous, and not at the very back where the view would be partial. She sat down, placed her clutch on her lap, and picked up the wedding program that had been left on the seat. She read it from beginning to end. She was going to be here for this. She had been invited. She had shown up. She was wearing a dress she had chosen carefully, and done her makeup with precision, and driven 40 minutes through the morning city to sit in this pew and witness this moment. She was not going to allow anything, not confusion, not pain, not the particular complicated weight of what she had seen in the courtyard, to take that from her. The program was beautifully made, Chioma's full name and Leonard's, printed together in gold, the order of service, the musicians, the members of the bridal party, a short note from the couple at the bottom, thanking their families for the love and effort that had made the day possible. The church continued to fill around her, and the fans turned overhead, and the organ played something slow and ceremonial, and somewhere near the front a soloist warmed her voice in preparation, and Adaize sat with her hands folded and her back straight, and waited for the ceremony to begin. She did not allow herself to think about Ngozi yet. She had filed the whole of it away in a compartment at the back of her mind, locked it carefully, and she was going to leave it there until she was ready for it. There would be time for all of it, for the understanding, the grief she could already feel sitting quietly in her chest, the questions without good answers. There would be time, and she would give it the time it deserved. But not now. Now, there was a wedding to attend. And she was, despite everything, here for it. She had been planning this morning for weeks, in the way that she planned things that mattered to her, not with visible fuss, not with lists pinned to walls or countdowns spoken aloud, but internally, quietly, with the precise attention she brought to anything she considered important. She had thought about what to eat the night before, so she would not have to make that decision this morning, when her attention was already divided. She had laid out her jewelry on the dressing table 3 days ago. A thin gold chain, small gold studs for her ears, a bracelet her mother had given her for her 28th birthday, that she wore to occasions that felt like they deserved the weight of something inherited. She had confirmed the address of the church twice, had mapped the route, had checked when traffic was typically light on a Saturday morning in this part of the city. She did these things not from anxiety, but from the conviction that proper preparation was the most honest form of respect you could show an occasion. You prepared. You thought about it in advance. You showed up ready. The showing up ready was itself a kind of gift, a signal, sent through the quality of your presence, that you understood what the occasion meant, and had honored it accordingly. The city outside her window was beginning to come alive. She could hear it, the low, early sounds of a Saturday morning gathering itself. Someone's radio, a car starting, the distant conversation of two people below on the street, their words indistinct but their tones pleasant, the particular quality of early morning voices that had not yet been worn down by the day. She had always liked this hour, when the city was in the early stages of itself, before the full weight of its daily motion had built up into something larger and faster and less personal. She thought about Chioma as she dressed. She had known Chioma the way you knew people whose lives were adjacent to your own for long enough, not closely, not intimately, but with the particular warmth of accumulated presence. She had seen Chioma at dozens of family occasions over the years, had watched her grow from the younger sister who was still in secondary school, when Adaize and Ngozi met into the woman who had stood up at a dinner table a few months ago and distributed invitations with an exactness and a deliberateness that Adaize had found quietly moving. Chioma had become herself in a way that was visible and satisfying to witness, even from a distance. She had the warmth of her mother and the precision of her father, and something that was entirely her own. A directness about what she wanted, and who she was. A lack of apology about the space she took up in a room. Leonard, the man she was marrying today, had a quietness that complemented her in the specific way that complementary things complemented each other. Not by being the same, but by being what the other was not, in ways that made both of them more legible in combination than they were individually. Adaize had met him twice. Both times, she had found him to be exactly what he appeared. A person who listened carefully, who thought before he spoke, who was not particularly interested in being impressive, but was genuinely interested in the people in front of him. She respected this. She thought Chioma had chosen well. These were the thoughts that occupied her as she drove through the early morning city. Pleasant, forward-looking thoughts. The thoughts of a person going somewhere they were genuinely glad to be going. The slight unease that had been living in the back of her awareness for the past few weeks. The 11-minute phone call. The fabric market, the general quality of distance she had been feeling from Ngozi, she had filed that away for the moment. She was not going to spend the drive to Chioma's wedding, sitting in the complicated feeling of recent weeks. She was going to arrive ready. That was what she had decided. The church was a large one on the mainland, the kind that held several hundred people comfortably, and had the particular architecture of a building designed to make its occupants feel the weight of permanence and ceremony. The exterior was cream and pale brick, set back from the street behind a compound with a wide courtyard and an avenue of trees along both sides of the entrance path. Adayeze had been to a service there once before, years ago, with Ngozi. For a family event she no longer remembered the specific occasion of. The church had stayed with her from that visit. The height of the ceiling, the quality of the light through the side windows in the morning. She arrived, paid the driver, and stepped out into the compound. The transformation the compound had undergone for the wedding was considerable. The trees along the path had been strung with small lights, subtle in the morning but surely beautiful in the evening if the party ran late enough for them to come on. Flower arrangements stood at intervals, white lilies and cream roses, and sprays of greenery. The pots of plants along the entrance path, large terracotta, glossy-leaved, clearly hired for the occasion and performing their decorative function with appropriate dignity, were new, or new to this context. Everything had been arranged to suggest that the usual space had been transformed into something specific to today, and the transformation had been done with care and intention. She stood at the edge of the compound for a moment, taking it in. This was something she did sometimes, paused at the beginning of an occasion to actually see it before she was inside it. Once you were inside, you moved, you responded, you reacted. The moment before you entered was the last moment of pure observation available to you. She liked to use it. Then she moved forward, into the gathering crowd. There are friendships that look strong from the outside, and are, in fact, strong. They hold up under real pressure, they survive disagreement and distance, and the slow changes that time makes to two people who started out very similar, and gradually, without meaning to, become somewhat different from one another. Those friendships exist. Adayeze had believed she was in one of them. She had been building that belief carefully for 12 years. The way a person builds something from materials gathered steadily over a long time. A memory here, a moment of crisis survived together there, a season of laughter that made the harder seasons feel survivable in comparison. She had believed in the friendship the way she believed in the chair she sat in at work, not consciously, not with active reflection, simply placing her full weight on it day after day, trusting it to hold, because it always had. She had not noticed, or had not allowed herself to fully notice, that the chair had been developing cracks. Not suddenly, not in any one dramatic moment. Cracks in friendships do not arrive with warning. They come the way most important changes come. Gradually, almost invisibly, and then all at once, visible only in retrospect when you look back and understand that what you thought was an ordinary, unremarkable week was actually the beginning of something ending. It had started with small things. In the months before Kiyoma's wedding, Ngozi had pulled back from Adayeze. Not completely. Not in any way that Adayeze could point to clearly and say, this is the moment, this is where it changed. It had been far more subtle than that. A phone call returned a day late instead of within a couple of hours. A text message left unread for an unusually long time before a brief reply arrived. A suggestion from Adayeze. There's a new restaurant near the roundabout that I've been reading about. Someone at work says the pepper soup is extraordinary. We should go. That Ngozi had agreed to in the moment, with all the warmth and enthusiasm that was natural to her, but which had then quietly expired without a date ever being proposed, the invitation dissolving, the way plans sometimes dissolve when one person is not really invested in making them happen. None of these things, taken individually, would have alarmed anyone. Life was genuinely busy for Ngozi. She had a demanding role at a marketing firm where she was being considered for a senior position, and the particular pressure of being evaluated for advancement while continuing to perform at your current level was the kind of thing that consumed mental energy in ways that were hard to explain to people who had not experienced it themselves. She had family obligations that multiplied as the wedding drew closer. She had her own world, her own separate life, and that life made reasonable and legitimate demands on her time. Adayeze had understood all of that. She had always understood it. She was not the kind of friend who needed daily contact or weekly plans, or the continuous reassurance of frequent communication, to feel secure in a relationship. In fact, one of the things she had valued most about her friendship with Ngozi was the ease of it, the way they could go 10 days without speaking, and then pick up exactly where they had left off, with no awkwardness, no accusation, no need for explanation. That ease had always felt, to Adayeze, like evidence of how solid the friendship was, that it did not require constant tending to stay alive. But she had been wrong about something. There is a meaningful difference between two people who can go a long time without talking because they are secure in each other, and two people who go a long time without talking because one of them has begun. quietly and without announcement, to retreat. The outward appearance of those two situations is identical. The inner experience of them is completely different. Adayeze had been inside the first situation for many years. She had not registered, until quite recently, that she might now be inside the second one. She had been explaining things to herself generously. That was her tendency. Had always been her tendency. To reach for the most compassionate interpretation available when it came to people she cared about. Ngozi was under pressure. Ngozi managed stress by turning inward. It was simply how she was built. There had been periods before, shorter ones, where Ngozi had gone quiet in this same way, and then emerged on the other side intact and present. And Adayeze had given those periods space, and they had passed without consequence. She was giving this one space too. But there had been an evening, about 6 weeks before the wedding, that she had filed away at the back of her mind without fully examining. She had gone to the fabric market on the mainland with her colleague Grace, who was purchasing material for a family occasion of her own. They had spent a pleasant afternoon moving between stalls, and Adayeze had bought herself a length of fabric she did not yet have a specific plan for, because the color spoke to her, and she trusted that occasions for beautiful fabric tended to arise. On the way back through the market, navigating the section near the Aso-Ebi vendors, she had seen Ngozi. Ngozi had been with 2 other women. One of them was a cousin of Ngozi's, who had come from Abuja for the month. A woman Adayeze recognized by her distinctive way of standing, always slightly sideways, always with one hand on her hip, as though posing for a photograph she had not been told about. The other woman Adayeze had never seen before. They were at one of the Aso-Ebi stalls, the ones selling the cream and gold fabric that had been chosen for Chioma's wedding. The unknown woman was holding a length of the fabric against herself and asking something, and Ngozi was examining it with her head tilted at the critical angle she used for evaluating clothes, the same angle she had used in 100 boutiques and fabric stalls and fitting rooms over the years. Adayeze had not been sure, in the first second, whether to call out. She was slightly behind Ngozi's line of sight, and the market noise was considerable. Grace was beside her, still mid-sentence about something. And then, in the second second, before she had made any decision, Ngozi had said something to the unknown woman. Quietly, a few words that Adayeze could not hear through the market noise, and the unknown woman had laughed, and Ngozi's cousin had laughed, and the unknown woman had put the fabric down and reached for a different length. Adayeze had kept walking. She had told Grace she had seen someone she knew, pointed vaguely, and then changed the subject immediately. That evening, sitting in her flat, she had told herself that what she had seen required no particular interpretation. Ngozi helping a friend or acquaintance choose Aso-Ebi fabric for her sister's wedding was a completely normal activity. Ngozi had dozens of people in her life. Not all of them were people Adayeze knew. The scene had been entirely ordinary, and the fact that it had stuck in her memory was more about her own state of mind than about anything significant having happened. She had told herself that, and she had largely believed it, but the image had not completely left her, in the way that images which carry some unexamined meaning tend not to completely leave. A week and a half before the wedding, she had called Ngozi on a Tuesday evening. Ngozi had answered after 3 rings, her voice already in its end-of-day register, a little lower and slower than her daytime voice. The call had lasted 11 minutes exactly. Adayeze had noticed the time on her screen when they said goodbye. 11 minutes was not an unusual call length between them. They had conversations that ran for 2 hours and conversations that ran for 5 minutes, depending on what was happening and what needed to be said. The length was not the problem. The texture of those 11 minutes was the problem. Ngozi had been pleasant throughout. She had been perfectly, demonstrably polite. She had asked after Adayeze's cousin's cold, which had been mentioned 2 conversations ago, and which Ngozi had apparently remembered. She had made a brief, funny comment about a television program they both watched. She had said she was tired, and that work was complicated, and that the wedding preparations were consuming more energy than she had anticipated. But she had not asked a single question. That was what lodged itself in Adayeze's awareness, and refused to be explained away. In 12 years, Ngozi had always asked questions. It was one of her defining qualities, a genuine curiosity about the people in her life that expressed itself in questions that were specific and attentive rather than formulaic. Not, "How are you?" as a conversational nicety, but, "How did the client presentation go, the one you were anxious about last week?" Not, "How is your family?" but, "How is your cousin adjusting to her new role?" Ngozi listened, and she remembered, and she asked questions that proved she had listened and remembered, and that quality had always been part of what made Adaeze feel genuinely known by her. In 11 minutes, there had been no questions. Ngozi had spoken. Adaeze had spoken. The conversation had moved forward, but in the mechanical way of two people going through the motions of a conversation, rather than actually having one. When they said goodbye, Adaeze had put her phone down and sat in her own quiet for several minutes, not quite thinking anything, and not quite feeling anything, simply sitting with the faint but persistent sense that something was not right. She had not called again before the wedding. She had told herself she was being respectful of Ngozi's time, that the days before a sibling's wedding were not the days for lengthy social calls, that she would see Ngozi in person, and it would be fine. So the woman who arrived at the church compound on Saturday morning was not entirely without awareness. Somewhere beneath the composure, beneath the optimism she had chosen and continued to choose, there was a knowledge she had been protecting herself from. She had been keeping herself at the edge of it, looking in, but not entering. Standing near the potted plants, watching Ngozi hand a cream envelope to a woman across the courtyard, she was no longer at the edge of it. She was in it, now. And what she felt, standing there in the morning light in her burgundy dress with the invitation in her clutch, was not the chaos she might have expected. It was something quieter, and more absolute. Something that settled in her like sediment settling in still water, slowly, covering everything evenly, changing the appearance of the whole floor without any drama. She understood now. The question was what she was going to do with the understanding. She could leave. That was the option that had briefly presented itself, the one where she turned around and walked back to the waiting cabs, and went home, and changed out of the dress, and spent the day doing something else entirely. That option had the appeal of simplicity, of not having to sit in a church and feel what she was feeling, while also presenting a composed face to the people around her, of not having to carry something this heavy through what was supposed to be a joyful occasion. But she had been invited, not by the woman with the envelope, not by Ngozi, by Chioma, by the bride herself, with both hands, with her name spoken aloud, with explicit and genuine pleasure. The invitation in her clutch was real. Her right to walk through that door was real. She had contributed to this day. She had bought a gift. She had shown up. She was dressed and present and had done nothing wrong, not one single thing, and she was not going to stand outside while the wedding happened without her, because someone else had decided, privately and without her knowledge, that she should not be there. She straightened her back. She picked up her chin slightly. She turned toward the church entrance, and she walked through it, alone, unhurried, without looking back. The sociology course had been called Social Dynamics in Contemporary Communities, which was the kind of title that told you very little about what you were going to be doing, and implied quite a lot about the kind of person who designed the curriculum. The professor was a small, intense woman who wore exclusively jewel-toned cardigans and spoke about social observation with the urgent sincerity of someone who believed that paying attention to other people was the most important skill any human being could develop. Adaeze had found her rather alarming, but also completely right, which was a combination she had learned to appreciate in professors over the years. The group project had initially been 4 people. One of the 4 had dropped the course entirely by the 3rd week, citing personal circumstances that turned out to be primarily a scheduling conflict with a film she wanted to see. The second had suffered a family obligation that pulled her back to Kaduna for 3 weeks precisely when the observation sessions were scheduled, which left Adaeze and Ngozi. They had met for the first time properly, not just as names in the same group, but as actual people attempting to organize something together, in the library on a Monday afternoon, to plan the sessions. Adaeze had come with a color-coded schedule. Ngozi had come with a large takeaway cup of something and a notebook that appeared to have been used for a different subject and not yet repurposed. They had looked at each other across the library table with the particular wariness of 2 conscientious students being asked to trust a stranger with a shared assignment. By the end of that meeting, they had made a plan, established a schedule, and laughed together twice. The second laugh had been about something stupid, something Adaeze could not now remember, only that it had been unexpected and genuine, and that she had felt, sitting across from this woman she barely knew, that the afternoon had gone better than it had any right to. The observation sessions at the bus park had run across 3 Wednesdays. They had divided their tasks and filled their notebooks and produced, in the end, an assignment that their professor had described as one of the most thoughtful pieces of social observation she had received in several years, which had pleased them both in different proportions. Ngozi had been characteristically pleased in the warm, uncomplicated way of someone who expected good work to produce good results, while Adaeze had been pleased in the way she was pleased by most things, quietly, and with a kind of interior nod that satisfied itself without needing expression. But more than the grade, she had carried from those 3 Wednesdays something that had turned out to last considerably longer: the particular ease of working alongside someone whose intelligence operated at a compatible register to your own. The specific pleasure of an observation, made precisely at the right moment, the recognition of something true together, the shared attention to the same details. These were the things that built, over time, into something more significant than 2 students completing a group assignment. They were the early materials of a friendship. 12 years. She had now lived almost a third of her life, alongside the particular fact of Ngozi in it. That was not nothing. That was the kind of thing that left traces everywhere, in the references you made that only certain people would understand, in the memories of places and occasions and small private jokes that had no documentation but lived in the specific overlap between 2 people's memories. She had those things. She would always have those things. Whatever happened next, those things did not unhappen. But she was beginning to understand that having those things did not mean the thing they were part of was still intact. You could have the memories of a house, and the house could no longer stand. The memories would not become false. The house would simply be what it had become. She read the program again. She read the names of the musicians. She read the list of officiants. She read the words that Chioma and Leonard had chosen for the ceremony, the specific selections from various texts that were supposed to say something about what they believed love was and what they intended for each other. The selections were good. She recognized one of them from a speech she had read years ago and had kept a note of because it said something in a way that was more precise than she had been able to achieve herself. The church was completely full now. The fans turned above. The air had the particular quality of many people in a clean, cool space, gathered for something they all understood to be significant. Adaeze sat in it, and was still, and the program lay in her lap, and the moment before the ceremony began had that particular quality of held breath that she had always found beautiful. Then the organ shifted. The breath released. The doors opened. Nobody told you that clarity could arrive without warning and without mercy. Nobody prepared you for the fact that it might come in a church courtyard on a bright Saturday morning, wrapped in an ordinary gesture, a hand reaching into a bag, an envelope passing between 2 people, and that it could rearrange, in a matter of seconds, something you had taken 12 years to build. Adaeze had always understood betrayal as a loud, theatrical thing. She had read about it in stories and seen it enacted in films. It had always involved confrontation, raised voices, things said in heat that could not be retrieved. There was a clear precipice, a before and an after, and the moment of the fall was unmistakable. This was not that. This was quiet. This was ordinary. This was so embedded in the normal rhythms of a busy wedding morning that most people would not have noticed it at all. And yet what it meant was not ordinary. What it meant was that a decision had been made, a specific, considered, private decision, over some period of time that Adaeze could not identify, for reasons she did not yet know, that had resulted in her not being wanted at the wedding she was currently walking into. She sat in the pew with her program and read every word of it. She was buying herself time, she knew that. She was keeping her eyes moving and her hands occupied so that the weight of what was sitting in her chest would not rise to the surface and show itself on her face. She was very good at this, had always been good at this, at holding difficult things in quiet containment while she functioned normally around them. Her colleague once said that in a crisis, Adaeze was the calmest person in the room, and it was true. The composure was not performance. She genuinely did not lose her head. But the steadiness cost something, and what it cost was the freedom to simply feel the difficult thing in the moment it was happening. She would feel it later. There would be space for it later. The program was beautifully designed. Chioma's name and Leonard's name were printed in gold across the front. The order of the ceremony was laid out inside, with the names of the musicians and the readers and the officiants. At the back, a thank you note from the couple, expressing gratitude to their families and to everyone who had made the day possible, through love and effort and consistent presence. Adaeze read the thank you note twice. The church was full now, or nearly so. The fans turned above her head. The flowers at the end of each pew gave off a faint, pleasant scent. The woman sitting to Adaeze's left was texting someone rapidly, and the woman to her right had fallen into a pleasant whispered conversation with the person beside her about the ceiling decorations. The organ shifted keys, and the congregation seemed to understand collectively that something was beginning. People straightened in their seats. Phones went away. The quiet that fell over a full church before a ceremony started was one of Adaeze's favorite sounds. Not silence exactly, but the deliberate hush of people agreeing to pay attention to the same thing at the same time. The doors at the back opened, and the procession entered. The bridesmaids came first, moving up the aisle in measured pairs. Dusty rose dresses, carefully chosen flowers, expressions that were warm and ceremonial at once. Adaeze watched each pair make the walk. She knew some of the faces, vaguely, women she had seen at family gatherings at Ngozi's house over the years, women she associated with birthday parties and holiday visits, and the particular kind of easy, domestic occasion that accumulates over a long friendship. And then Ngozi. She was paired with a taller woman, both of them walking in step, their flowers held at the correct angle. Ngozi looked beautiful. She moved with the same physical ease that had always been entirely hers. There was no effort in how she carried herself, no performance of grace. It simply existed in how she occupied space. The dress suited her. Everything about her presentation was perfect. She was going to pass Adaeze's row. Adaeze did not look away. She made the decision clearly and without drama. She was not going to look at the program or her hands or the ceiling. She was going to look at Ngozi, and she was going to watch what happened. The procession moved steadily up the aisle. Ngozi's gaze moved across the congregation in the general, acknowledging way of someone performing a role, seeing everyone in a broad, warmly impersonal sense. And then her gaze reached Adaeze's row and caught. There was a full second in which their eyes were on each other, and in that second, Adaeze saw everything she needed to see. First, recognition, immediate and complete. Then something that was unmistakably surprise. Not the large theatrical kind, but the tiny, involuntary kind that happens when something occurs that you had not fully prepared for. Then, almost instantly afterward, a composure being deliberately applied, a settling of the features, a choice to look away and keep walking. She looked away. She kept walking. Her flowers did not move. Her step did not falter. To anyone watching the procession, she was a bridesmaid, doing exactly what bridesmaids were supposed to do. Only Adaeze had the context. Only Adaeze had seen the courtyard. Only Adaeze had 12 years of close attention to Ngozi's face, and knew the difference between its natural expressions and a controlled one. This had been controlled. Ngozi had seen her, had registered her, had felt something, surprise, which meant she had not been certain Adaeze would come, which meant some part of her plan had relied on Adaeze not coming, and then she had pulled the shutters down and walked on. Adaeze felt the confirmation of this land in the quietest possible way, not with a gasp or a sudden sharp feeling, but with the low, final sound of something closing. A door she had left ajar, still hoping, closing at last. She turned her attention back to the procession. Chioma's mother walked next, magnificent and slow, on the arm of her husband. Her dress was a deep, jewel green that complemented the gold of the decor without competing with the bridal colors. She moved with the particular gravity of a parent who is watching something enormous happen to their child and is trying to carry the magnitude of it with dignity. Then the flower girls. Two small children who had absolutely no interest in measured steps or ceremonial composure. They came up the aisle scattering petals with the enthusiasm of people who had been given an important job and intended to do it to the absolute maximum. Petals went sideways. Petals went backward. One of them threw an entire handful straight up and watched them fall with a wide-eyed satisfaction that suggested she considered this an improvement on the original instruction. The congregation responded in the way congregations always responded to flower girls who were having a genuinely good time, with a collective warmth, a soft sound of amusement and delight, a slight loosening of the formal mood that the procession had established. Adaeze smiled. Not a forced smile, not the performative kind. A real one, brief and genuine, produced by two small children who were doing the most joyful possible version of their job, and were entirely unbothered by anyone watching. And then the music changed. Not a gradual shift. The organ moved cleanly from the ceremonial procession piece, into something that was recognizably the bridal entrance, and the congregation understood this signal and responded to it immediately. People turned. People stood. Phones rose. Chioma appeared at the end of the aisle. She was in white, as expected and as right. The dress was long and elegant, structured at the bodice and flowing from the waist, with a train that a small dedicated group of women were managing, with the focused professionalism of people who understood that their job was to be invisible. Her face, and this was the part that Adaeze felt, somewhere below the composure she was maintaining, her face was undone by happiness, not tearful, not trembling, simply radiant with the helpless, wide-open gladness of someone who has arrived at a moment they have been moving toward with their whole heart. At the front of the church, Leonard stood and watched her come. The woman sitting to Adaeze's right made a small sound and pressed her hand to her chest. Adaeze understood the impulse. Leonard's face when he saw Chioma was the face of a person who has prepared himself for this moment for months, and still finds, when it arrives, that he was not entirely prepared for how it would feel. There was an unguarded quality to his expression, a relief and a joy that was so immediate and so uncontrolled that it bypassed all decorum and simply existed there on his face for everyone to see. Adaeze clapped with the congregation as Chioma made her way up the aisle. She was glad. She was genuinely, sincerely glad for Chioma. That gladness was real, and it was clean, and it belonged entirely to her, and whatever else she was holding in her chest that morning, the gladness was not diminished by it. The ceremony was beautiful. The readings were well chosen and clearly delivered. The music from the choir was the kind that filled a large space without seeming to strain for it. Leonard's vows were precise and heartfelt, the vows of a man who had thought carefully about what he wanted to say and had resisted the temptation to make them grand. Chioma's vows made the congregation laugh twice, and then made them go very still, and then made them laugh once more, which was exactly the right rhythm for a woman who was funny and feeling everything simultaneously. When they said "I do," neither of them paused. They said it the way you say something you have already decided, the way it sounds when you are not choosing in the moment, but simply naming what is already true. Adaeze sat in her pew and was present for every moment of it. She clapped when the couple was declared husband and wife. She clapped when they turned to face the congregation for the first time in their new status, both of them looking slightly astonished by the reality of the moment they had been planning toward for more than a year. She clapped when the choir surged into the recessional, and when the couple began their walk back down the aisle, slowly, stopping twice to touch hands that were reaching toward them from the pews. She clapped for that too. When Ngozi passed her row again, in the recessional, there was no eye contact. The avoidance was deliberate. Adaeze could see it, the way a person's gaze moves around a point rather than through it, creating a small cleared space. She noted it and clapped through it, her hands continuing their steady, unhurried movement. When the procession had passed, and people began to stand and gather themselves and move toward the exit, Adaeze sat still for one more moment. She looked at the empty altar. She looked at the flowers. She held the program in her hands and read the couple's names one more time, gold on cream. Then she stood up, collected her clutch, and joined the crowd moving toward the light. The procession moved with the measured slowness that processions at weddings always moved with, each step a little more deliberate than a natural walking pace, each pair of bridesmaids creating a visual rhythm that the congregation responded to by going quiet and attentive, in the way of people who understand they are watching something that has a shape to it. Adaeze watched each pair. She noted the flowers, white and cream, held at a consistent angle that spoke of rehearsal. She noted the slight variations in how each pair managed the pacing, some more naturally comfortable with it, moving with ease, and some with the slight overcorrectness of people who are counting beats. She noted the way the guests responded, a contained warmth, heads turning, a low murmur of appreciation, at a particularly lovely combination of fabric and flowers and posture. She noted all of this with the specific, clear attention that she gave to things when another part of her was otherwise occupied. She had learned, over years, that the mind could do this, could observe and document in detail while simultaneously holding something difficult in a separate compartment. It was not compartmentalization in the dangerous sense, the sense where you push things away until they disappeared. It was more like the capacity to be fully present for what was in front of you, while simultaneously carrying what needed to be carried. The two activities did not compete. They coexisted, like two pieces of music in different keys, played simultaneously by different instruments in the same room. She was watching the procession, and she was holding the morning. Ngozi passed her row. What happened in the second of their eye contact was something Adaeze would return to later, when she had the space to examine it properly. She had always been a careful reader of faces, another thing developed over a lifetime of paying close attention to people, and what she had seen on Ngozi's face in that second was specific and clear. The surprise was the most significant part of it, not the recognition. She had expected recognition, but the surprise, the brief, involuntary widening of the eyes that happened when something occurred that you had not prepared yourself adequately for. It was the surprise of a person who had believed, until this moment, that a plan they had made was going to work, and who had just encountered the evidence that it was not working quite as intended. That surprise told Adaeze more than anything else could have. It told her that the giving away of the invitation had been, in some sense, strategic, that there had been an expectation attached to it, that Adaeze would not come, or would come and find no place for herself and leave. The plan had had a shape to it, and Adaeze's presence was evidence that the shape had not held. She sat with this understanding. She did not feel what she had expected to feel. She had expected, perhaps, a surge of something, anger, or hurt, or the particular complicated feeling of confronting something you had been half suspecting and had hoped to be wrong about. Instead, she felt the thing she had been feeling since the courtyard, which was the thing without a precise name, the quiet, absolute, irrevocable understanding, the settling of sediment in still water. The procession continued past her row. Chioma's mother moved with the dignity of a woman who had been waiting for this day and was allowing herself to feel the full weight of it without apology. Her husband walked beside her. Their expressions were the expressions of parents at the wedding of a child, a mixture of joy and completion and something else, something harder to name, the awareness that this moment represented a particular ending, alongside all the beginnings it also represented. The flower girls were magnificent. She had mentioned this already in her memory of the day, but it deserved emphasis. The flower girls were absolutely magnificent. They had been given a job, and they were doing it with every resource available to them, which included an apparent complete freedom from self-consciousness and an interpretive approach to the scattering of petals that resulted in coverage of a substantially larger area than had probably been envisioned. One of the girls stopped mid-aisle, without explanation, and turned to look back at where she had come from, with the expression of an artist evaluating the effect of her work. Then she turned back and resumed walking. The congregation's response to this was warm and real, a brief lifting of the formal mood into something more human and alive. Adaeze had smiled then, a real smile, produced without intention, by the simple pleasure of watching small children approach a ceremonial task with complete and joyful seriousness. Even in the middle of a morning that had asked quite a lot of her, that smile had been real. That was something she would think about later. The ability to feel genuine things alongside the difficult things, not instead of them. The joy for Chioma, and the pain about Ngozi, both present, not canceling each other out, simply coexisting in the same person on the same morning. She was a more complicated person than she had sometimes given herself credit for. Reception halls at weddings have their own atmosphere, distinct from the ceremony that precedes them. The formal solemnity lifts the moment you move from the sacred to the celebratory. People who were composed and careful in their seats loosen up by several degrees. Voices rise to natural volumes. Those who had been managing their emotions begin to let them breathe. Drinks appear on trays carried by young people in black and white, and the smell of good food drifts through the venue, and the DJ, who has been waiting patiently for the moment when it is his turn to be significant, begins to assert himself in small testing ways, before the couple's arrival makes it officially acceptable to turn the volume up. Adaeze walked into the reception hall and felt the shift of atmosphere immediately. The venue was a hotel ballroom on the mainland, approximately 40 minutes by convoy from the church, and the drive had been its own experience. A long procession of cars through Saturday afternoon traffic, horns and music, and the particular festive aggression of a convoy that knows it has right of way. She had ridden in a shared car with 3 women she did not know, all of them connected to the groom's family, all of them carrying the particular pleasantly exhausted energy of people who had attended the emotional peak of the day and were now moving toward the social portion. The ballroom was decorated in the same cream and gold palette that had threaded through every element of the wedding. Round tables with white linen, centerpieces of white lilies, and trailing green, a long raised table at the front for the couple and the bridal party. The lighting had been softened from the venue's usual brightness to something warmer and more flattering, and the effect was that everyone in the room looked slightly better than they had expected to. At the entrance, an usher with a printed list asked for her name. She gave it. He looked at the list. Then he looked at it again. Then he looked up with the carefully neutral expression of someone who has encountered a discrepancy and is determining how to handle it without causing embarrassment to either party. "One moment, please," he said pleasantly, and stepped aside to consult with a coordinator. Adeze stood where she was and waited. She understood, with the same quiet clarity with which she had understood everything else that day, what the problem was. She was not on the list. Her name had not been assigned a table, because whoever had managed the table assignments had either been told not to include her or had been provided a guest list from which her name was absent. This was the third piece. The courtyard, the aisle, and now this. The pattern was complete enough to read clearly. Ngozi had given the second envelope to someone else, had not included Adeze on the seating plan, and had perhaps assumed that the combination of the two would be enough to make the day inhospitable, that Adeze would arrive, find no place for herself, and quietly depart. The usher returned with a slightly apologetic expression. "I'm so sorry. It seems there's been a small administrative error." "Please don't worry," Adeze said. "I can see there are open seats at that table." She indicated a round table in the middle of the room, where 2 or 3 chairs were clearly unoccupied. "If it's all right, I'll sit there." The usher looked at the table, looked at her, and agreed that would be perfectly fine. She thanked him and walked over and sat down. The people already at the table were colleagues of the groom, it emerged, a group of men and women from the engineering firm where Leonard worked. They introduced themselves in the easy, informal way of people who work together, and are therefore accustomed to meeting strangers and absorbing them into existing social dynamics, without excessive ceremony. One of the men, whose name was Philip, had a manner of speaking that Adeze identified within the first 2 minutes as dangerously funny. He made observations about the wedding decor that were completely accurate and delivered with the perfectly straight face of someone who considered humor a serious matter. The woman beside him, Caroline, was direct and quick and asked Adeze what she did within moments of sitting down, not out of nosiness but out of the genuine interest in useful people that characterizes good professionals, who are always, at some level, thinking about the work. Adeze told her. Caroline listened properly and then said, with the focused energy of someone connecting two things that fit together, "I have a project that might need exactly that kind of thinking. I'm being serious. Can I give you my card before we leave?" Adeze said yes. The food came and it was very good. Jollof rice, with a flavor that suggested the caterer had been cooking rice for significant occasions for many years, and had refined their method accordingly. Chicken, fried plantain that had achieved the precise balance between softness and caramelization, a small salad with a lemon dressing that she had not expected to be as enjoyable as it was. She ate steadily and with genuine appreciation. The couple arrived to the room's full enthusiasm. The MC, a man in an exceptional suit who seemed to run on the specific energy of someone who genuinely believed that every wedding he presided over was the most important event currently happening anywhere in the world, introduced them with a level of commitment that was both excessive and somehow completely appropriate. The room stood. Music surged. Chioma and Leonard walked in holding hands, laughing at something one of them had just said, and they were so plainly, helplessly happy that the room responded to it the way rooms respond when they see something real. Adeze stood with everyone else and clapped. She watched the first dance. She watched the older relatives move onto the dance floor, aunties and uncles and grandparents finding their rhythm to the music, some of them with more confidence than technical skill, and none of them concerned by the difference. The elderly woman near the center of the floor moved with such complete, unhurried assurance that she seemed to be dancing to a song she had heard many times before and loved without reservation, and the sight of her made something ease in Adeze's chest that had been holding tension since the courtyard. Philip told her about the song the couple had chosen for their first dance, an old track that both sets of parents had reportedly played at their own weddings, which Philip delivered as fact, but with a slight inflection that suggested he was not sure whether it was intentional symmetry or a remarkable coincidence. Adeze told him she hoped it was intentional, because that made a better story. Philip said that was exactly how he thought about it, and that they were going to agree to assume it was intentional, regardless of the truth. She laughed at that. A real laugh. Unexpected and brief and completely genuine. Ngozi gave a toast. She was, of course, excellent at it. She was excellent at anything that required holding an audience's attention and making them feel both moved and entertained. The toast was warm and specific and funny in the exact right proportion. The story she told about Chioma as a child made the older family members nod with the particular satisfaction of people who had been there and were glad the story was being told accurately. The closing lines she said about Leonard were both gracious and a gentle, affectionate warning, and the room loved it. Adeze listened from the middle of the ballroom, among these new colleagues of the grooms, and watched Ngozi hold the room the way she always held a room, and tried, not for the first time that day, to hold the two truths at once. The warmth of the toast and the morning in the courtyard. The person at the microphone and the person with the envelope. They were the same person. That was the part that was difficult to hold. Not two versions of Ngozi. Just Ngozi, in her full complexity. Capable of this and of that. Both things true. She was going to have to think about that. Just not here. The evening continued. The dancing deepened. Children drifted to the edges of the dance floor, and then onto it, unable to resist any longer. Caroline gave Adeze her card, and Adeze said with sincerity that she would follow up early in the week. Philip said something in the final hour of the evening that made the whole table laugh so hard that Caroline had to put her drink down. When Adeze left, she said genuine goodbyes. She had not planned to feel anything but relief at leaving, and instead she felt the mild regret of leaving good company before the evening was entirely done. She did not go looking for Ngozi on her way out. She did not approach the bridal table or scan the room for the dusty rose dress. She simply made her exit, past the dance floor, through the main doors, out into the cool night air of the hotel car park. She stood there for a moment, in the quiet. Above her, the city lights bled upward into the sky, softening the dark and obscuring most of the stars. She could see a few. Not many, but a few. She thought about the flower girls and their chaotic petals. She thought about the elderly woman dancing without apology. She thought about Philip's perfectly timed observations and Caroline's focused, genuine attention. She thought about Chioma's face when the wedding song began, and about Leonard's unguarded expression when he saw her come through the doors. All of that had happened today, despite everything else that had also happened today. Both things, wrapped together, impossible to fully separate. She called for a cab and waited for it in the quiet, and when it came she got in, and the driver had the radio on at a low, late-night volume, and she rode home through the city, while the understanding she had been carrying all day slowly lowered itself from the place she had been keeping it, and began, for the first time, to fully settle. The MC had a name that nobody at Adeze's table could agree on by the end of the evening, which said something about either their attention spans or his delivery, or both. What nobody forgot was his quality of presence. He was fully, completely committed to this wedding, in a way that made the room feel it had been chosen, specifically, as the location for something that mattered. This was a gift. She had met very few people who had it. Ngozi had it. Chioma had it in her own way. The MC had it professionally, but the effect was real regardless of its origin. Philip, at their table, had his own version of the gift. He gave his full investment to the moments in front of him through the medium of precise observation rather than performance. He watched things very carefully and then said, at exact intervals, the specific true thing about what he had watched, in a voice so completely neutral that it took a full moment to understand you were meant to be laughing. The delay between the delivery and the comprehension was part of the mechanism. Deo, who sat beside him and had developed the practiced calm of someone who had learned Philip's timing, was already beginning to smile before the rest of the table had processed what had been said. Caroline was telling Adeze about a project at her firm, and Adeze was following the thinking with genuine interest. The problem had a shape she recognized from previous work, a structural issue that expressed itself as a surface problem, the kind that required a specific kind of lateral thinking to map correctly. She asked questions. Caroline answered them with the directness of someone who had been sitting with the problem for a while and was glad to be talking to someone with the capability to follow the full complexity of it. They talked about work for nearly 20 minutes, which should not have been the best conversation at a wedding reception, but which was, honestly, among the best of the evening. Not because the other conversations were lacking, Because Caroline's intelligence was the kind that made a shared problem more interesting than it had been before the conversation started, and that was a specific pleasure that Adeze did not take for granted. She had not expected this evening. She had arrived braced for difficulty and gotten difficulty. The seating list, the absence of her name, the management of that, the business of finding a table and sitting down in a room she had not been prepared for. She had managed all of that with whatever it was she had instead of panic. And then this. These people, this table, the ease of the company, the genuinely funny timing of Philip's delivery, the direct and useful intelligence of Caroline, Dio's perfectly calibrated responses, the food that had been very good, the dancing they had all watched with the specific pleasure of watching people who were having a genuinely good time. The evening had given her both things. The difficulty at the entrance, and then this at the table. Both things true. The difficulty and the grace. Both present, neither erasing the other, simply coexisting in the same hours of the same day. She was beginning to understand something about the capacity to hold both, not as an achievement or a point of pride, but simply as a fact about how experience worked when you did not try to manage it into only one thing. The day had been what it had been, complicated and real, and, in parts, genuinely better than she had expected. She could hold both of those things, and she was going to hold both of them, and neither was going to cancel out the other. Sunday arrived with stillness. Not the stillness of a peaceful morning, exactly, but the held breath of a day that knows the day before it contained something significant and is waiting to see how you intend to carry it forward. Adeze woke later than usual. She lay in bed after her eyes opened and did not reach for her phone. She simply lay there, in the gray-white light coming through the curtains, and let the events of the previous day arrange themselves into their actual shape. Sleep had done something to the material of it, sorted it, the way a strong current sorts sediment, heavy things settling to the bottom, leaving the surface clear. This is what she saw, now that the surface was clear. Ngozi had decided, at some point in the weeks or months before the wedding, that she did not want Adeze there. She had not said this. She had not communicated it. She had not done the simple, honest thing of having a difficult conversation that might have allowed Adeze to make her own choices with full information. Instead, she had worked around it, obtained a second invitation, or already had access to one, being the sister of the bride, and given it to the other woman, as though the gesture of multiplying the invitations could somehow dilute Adeze's right to use hers. And she had not put Adeze on the seating list. So the plan, if it could be called that, had relied on two things: Adeze arriving and finding no place assigned for her, and Adeze then leaving quietly, which was exactly what a person who did not know their own worth might do when they received that signal. The message embedded in the absent seat assignment was, "You are not really expected here," and absent an assigned seat, the social difficulty of staying would, perhaps, have been enough to make most people go. But Adeze had not gone. She had found a seat at a table that had room. She had introduced herself. She had eaten the food and watched the dancing, and laughed at Philip's dry observations, and accepted Caroline's business card, and stayed until she chose to leave, not until she was made to feel she should leave. She had watched the ceremony with her whole attention. She had clapped for the right things and felt the right things, and been present in a way that was completely real, not performed. She was proud of that. She allowed herself to feel that. And underneath the quiet pride, there was something else that she was only beginning to name. Something that had less to do with the wedding, and more to do with the 12 years preceding it. The friendship she had maintained with such care and consistency, and generous interpretation. The times she had explained away the behavior that would have concerned her in someone else's friend. The 11-minute phone call with no questions. The Aso-ebi stall. The slow pulling back that she had allowed herself to read as stress rather than withdrawal. She had been a very loyal friend to someone who, it now appeared, had not been quite as loyal in return. That was the thing she was going to have to sit with. She got up eventually, and made tea, and sat at the kitchen table while her cousin slept, looking out the window at the Sunday morning street. A man was walking a large dog that appeared to have very definite opinions about the route they should be taking. The dog won every negotiation. The man accepted each defeat with the resigned good humor of someone who had long since made peace with the hierarchy. Adeze drank her tea. She thought about what to do next, and she thought about it honestly, not in the dramatic, searching way of someone who does not know themselves, but in the practical, clear-eyed way of someone who does know themselves and is simply determining the right order of operations. She checked her phone. 4 messages, her cousin, asking when she had gotten home and reporting that there was leftover food in the fridge. Caroline, whose message said simply, "Lovely meeting you, speak soon." A work colleague forwarding a document. And Ngozi. Ngozi's message had arrived at 11:47 the night before. She clicked on it. It was a voice note, 22 seconds long. She played it. Ngozi's voice, slightly lower than usual, slightly too careful. "Hey, I hope the wedding was nice for you. It was a long day. I'm glad it went well. Talk soon." Adaize played it again. "I hope the wedding was nice for you." She put the phone face down on the table. She sat with what she had just heard for a long time. What had arrived in her inbox was not an apology. It was not an acknowledgement of what had happened, or an attempt to address it honestly. It was a performance, a careful construction designed to suggest that nothing unusual had occurred, that the day had been an ordinary day, that the appropriate response was to receive the message warmly and talk soon and allow everything to return to normal. As though normal were still available. As though nothing had happened that changed what normal meant. She finished her tea. She rinsed the cup. She went and got her laptop and sat back down at the kitchen table and opened a new document. She was going to write something. She was not going to call, because calling meant speaking in real time, and real time was where she did her worst thinking about things that mattered. She needed to write first. She needed to choose the words precisely before committing them to anyone else. She wrote, "I was in the courtyard when you gave the invitation to the other woman. I saw it. I want you to know that." She read that back. She added, "I went to the ceremony anyway. I stayed through the whole thing. I went to the reception. I had a perfectly fine evening." She added, "I'm not writing to you asking for an explanation. I am writing because I think you should know that I was there, and that I saw what I saw, and that I am not going to pretend otherwise." She stopped. "Read it again, from the beginning, 3 times. 9 sentences. Direct, clear, not angry in tone, not pleading, not a list of grievances, or a catalogue of all the times she had been generous and overlooked things. Simply a statement of fact from someone who had been present and paying attention." She let it sit in the document through the rest of the morning. Her cousin woke up eventually, and they talked about other things. A situation at her cousin's workplace that was genuinely interesting and required Adaize's full attention, and got it. They had lunch together. After lunch, Adaize went back to the document, read it one final time, and sent it as a message. Then she put the phone face down and picked up a book. The reply came 4 hours later. She read it in full, and then sat very still for a moment. There was no apology. There was an explanation that was partial, and arranged in a way that placed the responsibility for the decision on circumstances that were vague and external. Without naming what those circumstances actually were, there was a sentence that gestured toward warmth without the honesty that real warmth requires. And there was a reference to the length of their friendship, 12 years, invoked not as a tender thing, but as a kind of currency, as though the accumulated years were something that could be spent to absorb the current situation. She put the phone down. She did not reply that evening. She sat with the reply. She let it be what it was. And what it was, this she saw clearly, was not enough. Not enough to account for what had happened. Not enough to repair what had been damaged. Not enough to be the beginning of honesty between 2 people who had known each other for 12 years. She went to bed. She lay in the dark for a moment and thought about the wedding, and the flower girls, and Philip, and the way the old woman had danced in the middle of the floor without self-consciousness, and then she closed her eyes. She slept well. Understanding, even when it hurts, lets you rest. It is the not knowing that keeps you awake. She had understood. She rested. She had not. She realized lying in bed on Sunday morning, cried once. Not in the courtyard. Not in the church. Not in the reception hall or in the cab on the way home, or sitting at the kitchen table after she got in, when her cousin was finally asleep, and the flat was quiet, and there had been nothing to prevent it. She had not cried. That was not because she had not felt anything. She had felt quite a lot, throughout the day, in the particular contained way that she felt things, real and present, and located precisely in her chest, in the specific weight of something that was sitting where gladness used to sit, and was now sitting differently. She had felt all of it, but she had not cried. She examined this as she lay in the Sunday morning light. It did not feel like repression, the uncomfortable kind where something is held down that wants to come up, and eventually will. It felt more like, she reached for the right word and found it eventually, composure. Not the performed kind, not the kind people wore on their face to hide what was happening underneath. The real kind, the kind that comes from having been a certain way for a long time, from having practiced, without knowing you were practicing, the particular discipline of holding your own weight. She had been practicing this for 32 years. She had not known, until quite recently, that it was a skill, rather than simply a way of being. She had assumed that most people operated this way, held difficult things in proper containment while they continued to function, and that the people who did not were the ones who were simply built differently, or had not yet had occasion to develop the capability. She had understood, in her early 20s, that this was not entirely accurate, that the capability was not evenly distributed, and that the discipline she had always brought to her own inner management was something others found difficult, or even impossible. But she had still thought of it primarily as a way of being, rather than a skill. Sitting with the voice note from Ngozi on Sunday morning, hearing the careful construction of normality in 22 seconds of audio, she found herself appreciating the skill in a new way. Because the skill was not the composure itself. The skill was the composure in service of something honest. The ability to hold yourself together, not in order to avoid feeling things but in order to feel them properly, in the right order, in the right conditions, without contaminating the moment you were in, with the weight of the moment you were moving toward. She had been in Chioma's wedding. She had been present for all of it, genuinely and without reservation. And then she had come home. And now she was here. And now it was time to deal with what she had been carrying. She made the tea. She sat at the window. She watched the man and the dog below negotiate their route with the particular democracy of a relationship in which the smaller party had inexplicably accrued more decision-making power. She picked up the phone and played the voice note again. "I hope the wedding was nice for you." The thing about this sentence, she thought, was not that it was unkind. It was, in fact, quite kind on its surface. The wish that something was nice was a kind wish. The trouble was the word for. The distance contained in for. Not "I hope you enjoyed the wedding." Not "I hope it was a wonderful day." "I hope the wedding was nice for you," which placed Adaeze at a remove from the wedding, as though the wedding were something that happened independently of her presence in it, as though she were an observer rather than a participant, as though the question of whether she had been truly present were not one that required examining. "I hope the wedding was nice for you," as though the most significant question about the day was whether Adaeze had found it adequately pleasant. She put the phone down, finished her tea, and went to get her laptop. In the days that followed, Adaeze noticed something she had not expected. She noticed that she was not waiting. In the years of the friendship, there had been smaller moments of difficulty between them. Nothing as significant as this, but moments where something had been off, where the rhythm between them had been disrupted and needed time to settle. During those moments, she had been aware of a particular kind of internal alertness, a small, persistent readiness, a part of her tuned perpetually to whether Ngozi's name would appear on her screen, to whether the silence had broken, to whether things were moving back toward normal. That readiness was not there now. She checked her phone the same number of times a day she always had. She scrolled through the same applications, responded to the same kinds of messages, but the specific frequency she had always maintained for Ngozi, that dedicated channel of anticipation, had gone quiet. Not from any deliberate effort. It had simply settled, the way things settle when they have been properly released. This was grief, she understood, or the beginning of it, just not the kind that announced itself. People expected grief to be visible, to arrive with tears and insomnia, and the inability to eat or concentrate. Sometimes it did, but sometimes it arrived as this, the strange, clean quiet of a person who has understood something irreversible and is now moving through their ordinary life, with that understanding inside them, adjusting to the new shape of things, without drama or collapse. She went to work on Monday. Her project was in a demanding phase, and the difficult client had sent 3 emails over the weekend that needed careful responses before 9 in the morning, and the difficulty of getting that right occupied a significant portion of her mental energy through the first half of the day, in a way that she found, honestly, useful. She was good at her work, she was organized and clear-thinking, and calm under pressure, and sitting inside that competence for 8 hours was its own kind of stabilization. Grace asked at lunch how the wedding had been. Adaeze said it had been lovely, which was true. The wedding had been lovely. She did not say anything more, and Grace, who knew Adaeze well enough to recognize a sentence that was complete as given, did not press for elaboration. They talked about the difficult client, and about a new restaurant that Grace had heard about, and about a television series that they were both watching. On Tuesday, Adaeze emailed Caroline as she had said she would. They arranged a call for Thursday. Adaeze prepared for it with the same thoroughness she brought to every professional engagement, and the call went well. Better than well. Caroline's project had a specific kind of complexity that was interesting to think about, and Adaeze found herself still thinking about it on the bus home, which was generally a reliable indicator that she had found something genuinely engaging. By midweek, she was ready to respond to Ngozi's message. She opened a new document and wrote the response carefully. It was shorter than she expected. When you know exactly what you need to say, it turns out you do not need many words to say it. She acknowledged Ngozi's message. She named, quietly and without anger, what she had noticed in it: the absence of an apology, the arrangement of the explanation, the invocation of their history, as though length were the same thing as truth. She was not cruel about it, she was simply specific, in the way that specific is often harder to deflect than dramatic. She said, "I don't think what I need from you right now is a performance of normality. I think what I need is honesty, and that hasn't arrived yet." She said, "I'm not asking you to explain every decision that was made. I'm asking you to be honest about the fact that a decision was made, and to acknowledge that it was made about me without my knowledge." She said, "I can work with honesty. I don't know what to do with anything else." She sent it. The reply came 2 days later. She read it on her lunch break, at her desk, with her food in front of her. She read it once slowly. Then she put the phone down and ate the rest of her lunch. There was still no apology. There was something shaped like one, a sentence that moved in the direction of apology without quite arriving there, the verbal equivalent of reaching for something on a shelf and stopping just short of actually touching it. There was a defensiveness in the tone that had not been there in the first message, which she read as a sign that the clarity in her own message had landed and had produced discomfort, rather than the honesty she had asked for. She typed out a full reply, everything she was thinking, every true and clear thing. She read it over. Then she deleted it without sending. Not because it was wrong, because it was complete. She had said it to herself, and that was enough. She had reached the point in the conversation where more words from her would not produce more honesty from Ngozi. They would simply produce more defensive words from Ngozi, and the exchange would continue to generate heat without generating light. She was done adding to it. She was not going to make a statement about this. She was not going to post about it, or compose explanations for mutual friends, or engage in the slow, deliberate restructuring of a social world that some people undertook after a falling out. She was simply going to stop maintaining the connection. She was going to let the thread go slack. If Ngozi reached out, she would respond. She was not going to be hostile or cold or calculated. She was just not going to be the one who kept reaching, because she was no longer willing to be the person who did all the reaching, in an arrangement that she had only recently understood was not mutual. When she named this to herself, sitting at her desk with the window light coming through at its afternoon angle, she felt something. Not the sharp grief she had been bracing for, something quieter, like a room that has been kept sealed for a long time being opened at last. Like air. She had gone to work on that Monday with the particular quality of attention that comes from having rested well after something difficult. Not rested because things were resolved. Nothing was resolved, or not in the sense of being settled and finished, but rested because understanding had been achieved, and understanding, however unwelcome, allowed the body and mind to recalibrate. She had understood the shape of things. Now she was moving inside that shape rather than moving toward it. The project at work was demanding in the way that she found most valuable. It required her to use the precise part of her thinking that she most enjoyed using, the part that looked at complex systems and found where the inefficiency was actually originating, rather than simply where it appeared to originate. Her client was a mid-sized logistics company that had been experiencing consistent delays in one part of their process for 2 years. They had tried various surface-level fixes, each of which had produced temporary improvement followed by the return of the problem, and they were now at the stage of bringing in external perspective because they had exhausted their own capacity to see it clearly. She liked this stage, not the client's frustration, that was real and she respected it, but the intellectual challenge of the stage, coming in with fresh eyes to a problem that had been too close to see clearly, finding the actual source of the inefficiency that everyone inside it had stopped being able to perceive because it was part of the water they swam in. This was what she was good at. She was good at other things too. She was a competent manager, and a clear writer, and a reliable colleague, and a fair evaluator of other people's work. But this specific thing, the finding of the actual problem inside the apparent problem, was the thing she was unusually good at, and she knew it. And the knowledge of it was a source of quiet, settled confidence that had nothing to do with arrogance, and everything to do with having done this work long enough, and well enough, to understand where her capabilities were genuinely exceptional. Having something you were genuinely exceptional at was not a small thing. She thought about this sometimes when the other areas of her life felt complicated. She thought, I am very good at this. This is real and true, and belongs to me, in a way that does not depend on anyone else's assessment, or anyone else's presence in my life. And then the thought did its small, stabilizing work, and she returned to the problem in front of her. The project with Caroline was a version of this too. Different context, different specific shape, but the same underlying kind of thinking, finding the actual thing underneath the apparent thing. She had been turning Caroline's description of the problem over in her mind since their first call, and she had found the seam she was looking for, the place where the real issue sat underneath the surface presentation of it. She was looking forward to the next conversation. She had not expected, at the wedding, to walk away with something professionally promising. She had gone to witness a marriage, and to honor an invitation, and to navigate whatever the morning contained. The fact that it had also produced Caroline and a real professional conversation was the kind of thing that happened when you showed up to things fully, rather than managing your presence at them from a slight remove. She had shown up fully. She always showed up fully. That was perhaps one of the most consistent and most costly things about her. There are things you only understand once you have stopped doing them. Loyalty, for instance. Adaeze had been loyal to Ngozi for 12 years, with a consistency that had never required conscious effort, because loyalty that requires effort is not quite the same thing as the kind that flows from genuine love. She had been generous in her interpretations, present in difficult moments, attentive to the small things that most people overlooked. The specific thing Ngozi had been worried about 2 weeks ago, the thing she had wanted to achieve last month, the anniversary of the loss that she carried quietly. She had given time and care, and the kind of deep, sustained attention that tells a person they matter to someone in the specific and permanent way that matters most. She had not done this strategically. She had done it because Ngozi was her friend, and because this was how she understood friendship, and because the friendship had felt, from where she was standing, worth every bit of it. What she understood now, standing on the other side of it, was something she had not had the clarity to see while she was still inside the doing of it. She had been loyal in the way you are loyal to something you believe is loyal in return. Her generosity had been real, but it had not been unconditional. It had been built on an assumption of mutuality that she had never tested because she had never doubted it. The assumption was, Ngozi values this as much as I do. Ngozi is, in her own way, doing the same work. The friendship is two people holding it up, even if they hold it up differently. That assumption had turned out to be wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not in the way of a sudden revelation that changed everything in one loud moment. Wrong in the gradual, accumulating way that things are wrong, when the evidence has always been there, but you have been choosing, for very good and compassionate reasons, not to look at it directly. She had been carrying a weight she had not known was there, and now she was not carrying it. The particular lightness that had settled over her life in the weeks since the wedding was still present, not triumphant. Not the lightness of someone who has won something or been vindicated. Simply the physical ease of a person who has been carrying something heavy without knowing it, and has set it down, and has only now become aware of what the carrying cost. She moved through her days with a quality of attention she had not been aware she was missing. Things she normally rushed through, she found herself doing more carefully. The morning cup of tea that she usually drank standing at the kitchen counter while mentally running through the day's first tasks, she had taken to sitting down with it. The route from the bus stop to her building, which she had been walking for 2 years without really seeing, she had started noticing. The light at a particular corner in the late afternoon, the way the trees along one section of the road had begun shifting toward the colors of the coming season. It was not that her life had been bad before, but a portion of her awareness had been perpetually directed sideways, toward the maintenance of something, toward the monitoring of whether everything was all right between her and Ngozi, toward the subtle ongoing project of keeping the friendship in the shape she wanted it to be in. She had not known she was doing this until the direction of that attention was no longer needed, and she felt, suddenly, what it was like to have it back. August was settling into the city with heat that was serious in the middle of the day, but gentled in the evenings into something more bearable, the air after afternoon rains carrying that particular smell, concrete after rain, somewhere between clean and warm, that Adaize had always found comforting, without being able to fully explain why. She had grown up in a house with a concrete yard, and perhaps it was that, the smell of a known place, the smell of somewhere that was hers. She was working on the project with Caroline, which had developed into something genuinely interesting. The problem at its center was not the obvious problem. She had identified early on that what the client described as the issue was actually a symptom of something structural that sat several layers underneath, and the process of mapping that structural problem and proposing a solution that addressed it, rather than its surface manifestations, was exactly the kind of thinking she was good at. She came home from work in the evenings with the productive tiredness of someone whose day had asked something real of them and been given something real in return. She joined the book group that Grace had been mentioning for almost a year. It met on alternate Wednesday evenings in the back room of a bookshop on the island. The room smelled of old paper and was lit by 2 standing lamps that were not quite bright enough for serious reading, but were exactly right for the particular dimmed intimacy of a book discussion. 7 regular members, a mix of backgrounds, professions, ages. They read widely and argued well, and had the particular quality that Adaize valued in any group, the ability to disagree without anyone becoming unpleasant about it. She had attended twice by the end of the month. The first session she had listened more than she spoke, which was her default in any new situation, getting the measure of the room before committing herself. The second session she had said something about the novel they were discussing, a point about structure that she had been turning over since she finished the last chapter, and Bisi, the woman to her left, who had a mind that moved fast and precise, who reminded Adaize, pleasantly, of herself, had looked at her and said, "Yes, that's exactly it. I couldn't find the words for it." That small moment had stayed with her. She was building things, not as a project, not as a deliberate effort to fill the space that had been freed up, just naturally, the way a person builds things when there is space to build, when the energy that has been directed toward maintenance is available for other purposes, and when the other purposes turn out to be more interesting than the maintenance had been. She heard about the next wedding through Philip. Philip sent a message in the group chat that Leonard had, apparently at Kiyoma's explicit instruction, added her to at some point during the reception evening. Leonard has been notified by Kiyoma that her cousin Amara is getting married in October, and all of us are expected to attend, because as of Kiyoma's wedding, we are now apparently considered family. The group responded with affectionate exasperation. One of the other colleagues, a man named Dio who had a gift for a short sentence, wrote simply, "Already." Adaize replied, "I would like to know exactly what I did to become family." Philip replied, without a pause, "You survived the first wedding. That's the entry requirement." She smiled at her phone and put it back in her bag. There was something funny about this. There was also something she wanted to sit with quietly for a moment. The fact that the morning she had dreaded, the morning that had turned out to be what it had turned out to be, had also produced this. These people she had not known existed before she sat down at the nearest available table. These people who had made room for her without question, and had been good company, and had sent her home with a business card and a dry joke, and had added her to a group chat as though it were natural to do so. She had not gone looking for this. She had not been strategic. She had simply sat down where there was room, and they had been there, and they had been the best part of a day that had asked quite a lot of her. That was how life sometimes worked. A door closing, or being closed, by someone else, without your knowledge, while a window you had not been looking at, Opened somewhere you were not looking. She was not going to overstate what this was. A group chat, 2 calls, one excellent Suya outing with Grace that had nothing to do with any of this. The beginning of something, possibly, with a few new people. Not a replacement for 12 years, not a compensation. Just what it was, some new people, some real connection, some possibility that was unencumbered by the history she was now carrying differently. That was enough. She was learning to let things be enough. One evening in the 3rd week of August, her phone produced a notification. A message from Ngozi. Brief, just a few lines. No subject matter of consequence. At the end of it, a photograph. An old book cover, worn at the corners. The title slightly faded. A book they had both read in the 2nd year of university. The year of the bus park and the sociology assignment. The year they had become friends. A book Adayeze had returned to twice since then, and thought about often. Beneath the photo, a line. Found this in a second-hand stall this afternoon. Thought of you. Adayeze looked at it for a moment. There was something there. Not in what was said, but in what was not said. No apology. No reference to any of the messages they had exchanged. No acknowledged weight between them. Just the photograph and the line about thinking of her, which was its own small, careful thing. Not a resolution. Not a reopening. Just, I saw this and you came to mind. She replied, I loved that book. 3 words. True ones. Ngozi replied with a quiet, settling emoji that said nothing loud and committed to nothing large. Adayeze saw it, and put her phone down, and sat with the feeling that the exchange had been exactly the right size. No bigger, no smaller. They were not friends in the way they had been. She did not know if they were friends in any meaningful current sense. They were something that did not have a clean name yet. 2 people who had shared a significant portion of their adult lives, and were now at the point in the story where the next chapter had not been written yet. Not enemies, not strangers. Not the friendship they had been. Something between those things. Honest about its own uncertainty. She could live with that. She had learned, in the past several weeks, that living with uncertainty was more manageable than she had always thought, provided the uncertainty was honest, rather than performed. On a Friday evening at the end of August, she sat on the small balcony of the flat with a glass of water and the book she was reading for the next session of the book group. The evening air was warm from the day and gentled by the afternoon rain, and the street below was doing what streets in Lagos did on Friday evenings, filling up, coming alive, generating the particular energy of a week ending and a weekend beginning. She read for almost an hour. When the light was no longer sufficient, she closed the book and sat with the evening. She thought about the morning of the wedding. The woman she had been, precise, composed, dressed beautifully, driving across the city in the early light with gospel music playing and an invitation in her clutch. Standing near the potted plants and understanding, in a few seconds, something that rearranged the internal landscape of 12 years. And walking in anyway. She had not known, in that courtyard, that she would be all right. She had not known that a table in a ballroom would yield good people, or that a business card accepted in good faith would grow into a professional engagement she found genuinely interesting, or that a group chat full of people she had just met would, on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, make her feel that she belonged somewhere without having had to ask for it. She had not known any of that. She had simply made the next right decision, and then the one after that, and then the one after that, until enough right decisions had accumulated to constitute a path through. That, she thought, was how most things actually worked, not in the single, grand, clarifying moment. In a series of small decisions, each one made in the particular circumstances of its moment, each one followed by the next. She sat on the balcony in the August warmth and breathed the air that smelled of rain on concrete and the particular aliveness of the city that surrounded her, and she was glad to be there. Not happy in the simple, uncomplicated way, glad in the deeper sense. The sense that comes from having been handed something difficult and having found, to your own steady surprise, that you were equal to it. She was still herself. More precisely herself, if anything. The evening continued. She stayed on the balcony longer than she had planned to, because the air was good, and the evening was good, and there was nothing pressing her back inside. Eventually her cousin called from the living room about something on television that apparently required her immediate attention. "Coming," she called. She picked up her book, her glass, and went inside. She had gone to work on that Monday, with the particular quality of attention that comes from having rested well after something difficult. Not rested because things were resolved, nothing was resolved, or not in the sense of being settled and finished, but rested because understanding had been achieved, and understanding, however unwelcome, allowed the body and mind to recalibrate. She had understood the shape of things. Now she was moving inside that shape, rather than moving toward it. The project at work was demanding in the way that she found most valuable. It required her to use the precise part of her thinking that she most enjoyed using, the part that looked at complex systems and found where the inefficiency was actually originating, rather than simply where it appeared to originate. Her client was a mid-sized logistics company that had been experiencing consistent delays in one part of their process for 2 years. They had tried various surface-level fixes, each of which had produced temporary improvement followed by the return of the problem, and they were now at the stage of bringing in external perspective because they had exhausted their own capacity to see it clearly. She liked this stage, not the client's frustration, that was real, and she respected it, but the intellectual challenge of the stage, coming in with fresh eyes to a problem that had been too close to see clearly, finding the actual source of the inefficiency that everyone inside it had stopped being able to perceive because it was part of the water they swam in. This was what she was good at. She was good at other things too. She was a competent manager, and a clear writer, and a reliable colleague, and a fair evaluator of other people's work. But this specific thing, the finding of the actual problem inside the apparent problem, was the thing she was unusually good at, and she knew it, and the knowledge of it was a source of quiet, settled confidence that had nothing to do with arrogance, and everything to do with having done this work long enough, and well enough, to understand where her capabilities were genuinely exceptional. Having something you were genuinely exceptional at was not a small thing. She thought about this sometimes when the other areas of her life felt complicated. She thought, I am very good at this. This is real and true, and belongs to me in a way that does not depend on anyone else's assessment or anyone else's presence in my life. And then the thought did its small, stabilizing work, and she returned to the problem in front of her. The project with Caroline was a version of this too. Different context, different specific shape, but the same underlying kind of thinking, finding the actual thing underneath the apparent thing. She had been turning Caroline's description of the problem over in her mind since their first call, and she had found the seam she was looking for, the place where the real issue sat underneath the surface presentation of it. She was looking forward to the next conversation. She had not expected, at the wedding, to walk away with something professionally promising. She had gone to witness a marriage and to honor an invitation, and to navigate whatever the morning contained. The fact that it had also produced Caroline and a real professional conversation was the kind of thing that happened when you showed up to things fully, rather than managing your presence at them from a slight remove. She had shown up fully. She always showed up fully. That was perhaps one of the most consistent and most costly things about her. 3 weeks after the wedding, she ran into Ngozi. Not by any arrangement. Not at a gathering or a shared occasion. She ran into her at a pharmacy on a Wednesday evening, both of them reaching for the same display shelf at almost the same moment, a Diaze for throat lozenges, because a scratch had been developing in her throat all day that she wanted to address before it became something worse, Ngozi for something she could not clearly see. They stopped. There was a moment, the kind of moment that takes longer to pass than a moment should, in which they looked at each other, and everything that had happened, and everything that had not been said, sat between them, in the narrow pharmacy aisle, between the display shelf and the products behind the glass counter, in the evening of a perfectly ordinary Wednesday. "Hi," Ngozi said. "Hi," Adaeze said. Ngozi looked well. She always looked well, or nearly always. Tonight there was a slight tiredness to her, the tiredness of someone who had come directly from a long day, but it was the surface tiredness of a person whose underlying health was fine. Her eyes, when they met Adaeze's, were complicated. They were not unkind. They were the eyes of a person who knows they are standing in a debt they do not know how to begin to pay. "How are you?" Ngozi said. "I'm well, thank you," Adaeze said. "How are you?" "Busy." Work is, the small gesture that meant work is always what work always is. You know. Adaeze nodded. A brief silence, not hostile, not comfortable. The silence of two people who know each other very well, and are now standing in what that knowledge has become. Kioma told me you were lovely at the wedding, Ngozi said, carefully, as though she had been keeping it nearby in case she needed it. Kioma is kind, Adayeze said. She was a beautiful bride. She was. Ngozi's voice shifted slightly on that, a genuine softening, something real and unguarded. Whatever was complicated between them, whatever Ngozi was and was not capable of, her love for her sister was not complicated. It was one of the truest things about her. Adayeze had always known that about her. A second silence. I got your second message, Ngozi said. I know. I've been. She stopped, started again, differently. I haven't known what to say. Adayeze looked at her steadily. The look she used when she was listening carefully, and the person she was listening to, needed to understand that. I think you know what you would need to say, she said. I think the difficulty isn't knowing it. The difficulty is saying it. Ngozi looked down for a moment. The look of a person consulting something inside themselves. When she looked back up, her expression had shifted, not all the way to open, not entirely unguarded, but closer to honest than she had been in any of the messages. I did something that wasn't fair to you, she said. It came out quietly, direct. For the first time she was naming it, not describing circumstances, not framing it from the outside, but naming it as something she had done. Yes, Adayeze said simply. A breath. I'm sorry, Ngozi said. 2 words. Quiet. No performance around them. In the aisle of a pharmacy on a Wednesday evening, with the fluorescent lights overhead, and a pharmacist moving around behind the counter, and the street noise coming through the open door. 2 words. Plain and genuine. Adayeze was quiet for a moment. Thank you for saying that, she said. And then she took the box of throat lozenges from the shelf, walked to the counter, paid for them, thanked the pharmacist, and walked out through the door, into the evening air. She did not look back. She did not wait to see what Ngozi would do next. She had said what she needed to say, and received what had been offered, and she was going to let both of those things be exactly what they were, without demanding anything more of the moment. An apology was not a restoration. It was not a return to how things had been, and it was not a guarantee that how things had been was something worth returning to. An apology was an acknowledgement, a person saying, plainly and without decoration, that they knew they had caused harm. It was the minimum honesty that a difficult situation could produce. Whether it was the beginning of something or the last word in something was a question she would not know the answer to tonight. She walked to the corner and stood in the warm evening air and waited for a cab. Around her, the street was doing its Wednesday evening things. A woman walking fast, talking into her phone. 2 men outside a stall in the middle of a conversation that appeared to be about something they both found very interesting. The smell of food from somewhere nearby. The distant ongoing sound of the city being the city. Constant, various, indifferent to the particular meanings of any individual moment within it. She put the lozenges in her bag. She felt, standing at the corner, something she had not fully expected to feel. A small, uncomplicated lightness that had nothing to do with resolution and nothing to do with triumph. It was the lightness of having received something real from someone who found it genuinely difficult to give. Not everything, but something. And the something was real, and she had acknowledged it, and she had been careful not to consume it or inflate it beyond what it actually was. That felt like the right management of a complicated thing. The cab came. She got in. She rode home through the city and thought about none of it particularly. Just let the lights and the motion of the city come in through the window and do what motion always did. Carry you from one place to another, from one moment to the next, without asking your permission or waiting for you to be ready. Upstairs, her cousin was watching something on television and called out when she heard the key in the door. Adayeze, come and see this. I cannot explain it. You have to see it yourself. Adayeze put her bag down, took off her shoes, and went to the living room. She sat down beside her cousin and looked at the screen. What happened? She asked. Her cousin told her. It took several minutes and was enthusiastic and not entirely coherent, but Adayeze got the shape of it, and the shape of it was genuinely funny. They watched the rest of the episode together, and her cousin made commentary throughout, as she always did, and at some point, they were both laughing at something that had not been designed to be as funny as it turned out to be. Adayeze laughed until the laugh ran out naturally, and then she was quiet, and then she was tired, and then it was time for bed. She lay in the dark for a moment before sleep came, and she thought, I am going to be all right. Not immediately, not without continuing the work of it. But in the way that things you have faced honestly tend to be all right, eventually, given enough time and enough willingness to keep going. She was going to be all right. She knew it the way she knew things that were true, not from hope, but from honest assessment. She slept. The second message had been written on a Wednesday evening, 10 days after the wedding, after she had held Ngozi's long reply for several days, and had understood it fully, and was now ready to respond to it with everything she could bring to it. She had sat with the reply for those 10 days, not from avoidance, but from the discipline she brought to things that required precision. She had read it multiple times over the first 2 days, and then put it down, because reading a reply repeatedly, when you have not yet arrived at clarity, is not reading, it is circling, and circling produces anxiety rather than understanding. She had let it sit, she had gone about her week, she had worked on the project, and had lunch with Grace, and had a brief, pleasant exchange with Philip in the group chat about whether the wedding had been more or less elaborate than Philip had been expecting. She had gone to the book group for the first time, and then, on Wednesday evening, she had sat down with the reply again, and this time it had been clear. The reply had done two things. It had tried to explain the decision without acknowledging that a decision had been made, which was the particular rhetorical sleight of hand of placing a series of circumstances before the reader in a way that suggested inevitability, without ever saying, and this is what I did, and why I did it, and I take responsibility for it. And it had invoked the 12 years as a kind of collateral, a deposit against which the current situation could be borrowed, a long history that was meant to absorb the present difficulty without requiring the present difficulty to be named directly. Both of these things were familiar to her. She had seen them before, in other contexts, in other people. They were the tools of someone who was not yet ready to be honest, but who needed to say something, and who therefore produced a construction that was shaped like honesty, without being honesty. She did not say any of this in the message she sent. That was not the message she was trying to write. She was not writing a deconstruction of Ngozi's rhetoric. She was writing something simpler and more direct. What she needed, stated plainly, without anger, without performance, without the particular kind of pressure that came from making someone feel guilty, rather than making them feel the necessity of honesty. She needed honesty. She had said so. She had said what honest would look like from where she was standing. She had sent it. And then she had not picked up her phone for 2 hours, which was the correct amount of time to give a message after you had sent it, long enough to make it genuinely clear that you were not waiting for an immediate response, short enough that you had not gone so far from the conversation that you had lost connection with it entirely. The reply had come 2 days later. She had been at her desk when it arrived. She had finished what she was doing before reading it, not from anxiety, but from the practice she had developed over years of not letting her phone interrupt things that required her full attention. She had finished the analysis she was in the middle of, saved it, and then picked up the phone. She read it once, put the phone down, made tea, came back to it, read it again. And then she sat for a long time with what she had read, and what she understood, and what she was going to do with both. There is a particular kind of morning that arrives not dramatically, but with a different quality of light, something imperceptibly cleaner about the air, something more settled about the silence before the day begins its noise. Adaizi had learned to recognize these mornings over the years. They were not the mornings of change or decision. They were the mornings after change and decision, when you wake up and realize that something which has been happening has finished happening, and that you are standing in what comes after it. She woke on a Thursday morning in late August, 5 weeks after the wedding, with the uncomplicated sense that she was on the other side. She had not made any grand declarations. She had not drawn any lines or composed any final statements. She had simply continued. Gone to work, attended meetings, made food, called her mother on Sundays, talked with her cousin about her cousin's life, read books, paid attention to the things worth paying attention to. In that continuing, something had completed itself. She was not waiting anymore. The particular low-level readiness she had carried for weeks, the sense of something unresolved requiring attention, of a frequency tuned to whether or not Ngozi's name would appear on her screen, had settled, not shut down, settled, the way water settles after something has passed through it. The surface was still. She checked her phone, and Ngozi's name was among the names she might hear from, in the way that all names were among the names she might hear from. without the specific weight of anticipation that one name, for a long time, had carried. She got dressed and went to work. The project with Caroline had reached a stage that Adeze found genuinely satisfying, the stage where the structural problem she had identified was being addressed at its root rather than its surface, and where the client's resistance was beginning to give way to something more engaged, more curious. She had a presentation to prepare for the following week, and she began working on it with the particular focused pleasure of someone who has done the hard thinking already and is now putting it into a form that others can receive. At noon, she and Caroline spoke by phone. The call ran longer than scheduled because the conversation was useful, and neither of them wanted to leave a useful idea half explored. After they said goodbye, Caroline said, as though thinking of it, "I meant to ask you this before, but I kept forgetting. At the wedding, when everyone was clapping and celebrating, I looked over at you, and you looked completely present, like you had decided exactly what kind of person you were going to be in that room. Was that difficult?" Adeze considered this for a moment. "Yes," she said. "Some of it was difficult." "I thought so," Caroline said. "The reason I could tell you had decided was because of how quiet you were about it. People who decide things quietly are the ones who have actually decided them." Adeze thanked her and the call ended. She sat at her desk for a while afterward, thinking about that. About what it meant to be seen from the outside, in the shape of the effort you had made, by someone who knew nothing of the specifics. Caroline had only the form, the composure, the presence, the quality of having decided. She had not known what the decision cost, or what it was made against, and yet the decision had been visible, in the way that things which are genuinely true tend to be visible even when you are not advertising them. She had been paying attention her whole life. It was simply part of how she was made. She had paid attention to Ngozi for 12 years, to her moods and her silences and her words, and the words she did not say, to the questions she asked, and then to the questions she stopped asking. All that attention, all that careful witnessing of another person, in service of maintaining something she had believed was mutual. She was not going to stop paying attention, but she was going to pay it differently, not in service of managing another person's feelings about her, but in service of honestly seeing what was there and allowing it to be exactly what it was. She took a slightly different route home from work that afternoon, through a part of the island she did not usually walk through, where the light came down between the buildings at an angle that she had heard described once and never gone to see. She went to see it. It was exactly as described. She stood in it for a few minutes without doing anything particular. Then she walked the rest of the way home. She made dinner and ate it slowly, and called her mother, who had a long story about a neighbor, a misunderstanding involving a garden fence, and a goat that had opinions. Adeze listened with her full attention, and laughed at the right moments, and said the right things. And the warmth of her mother's voice across the distance was not nothing. It was, in fact, quite a lot. After the call, she sat in the kitchen in the quiet. She thought about the wedding, not with pain exactly. With something more like retrospective clarity, she thought about the ceremony. Chioma's face when the song started, Leonard's unguarded expression, the flower girls and their exuberant petals, the choir filling the tall space of the church, the elderly woman on the dance floor who moved as though dancing were something she had known how to do for longer than most people had been alive. She thought about Philip's straight-faced observations, and Caroline's direct interest, and the good jollof rice, and the way the evening had been, in the end, more than bearable. She was glad she had gone. She was glad she had stayed. She was glad she had walked in alone. Not because it proved anything to anyone, not because it was a statement directed at Ngozi or at anyone else watching. She was glad because when the moment came, when she stood in the courtyard with the understanding sitting plainly in front of her, she had not made herself smaller. She had not accommodated someone else's attempt to exclude her by excluding herself. She had taken up exactly the space she had been given the right to take up, and she had filled it with her entire, composed, intact self. The satisfaction of that was not pride in any ordinary sense. It was something more specific, the knowledge that she had been exactly who she was when it mattered, that the self she had shown up as was the self she actually was, that she had not bent or diminished or performed in order to manage the situation. She had simply been herself, and herself had been enough. Philip posted in the group chat that evening a photograph of Leonard looking happy and tired simultaneously, with a caption about newlywed energy. Everyone responded with warmth. Adaeze added a line that made Caroline respond with a laughing emoji, and Dio respond with the single word, accurate. BC from the book group sent a message to the group about the novel for the next session, asking whether anyone had started it yet, and what they thought of the opening. Adaeze had started it. She wrote back that the opening was difficult, but that she thought the difficulty was intentional and worth staying with. 2 people from the book group responded with similar assessments. She put her phone down and washed the dishes, and the evening settled into its ordinary shape, and she was in it, not thinking about anything that was not actually in front of her, not monitoring anything that was not actually happening, not directing any portion of herself sideways toward the maintenance of something that no longer required her. She was simply here, in her kitchen, at the end of a Thursday, listening to her cousin watch something in the next room and drying a bowl and being, in the most unremarkable and fully satisfying way, exactly where she was. The thing about letting a thread go slack was that it required a different quality of discipline than pulling it taut. Pulling a thread taut, maintaining tension in a relationship, keeping the contact going, being the person who remembered and followed up and initiated, required effort, but it was a familiar kind of effort, the kind that had a clear direction and a clear reward. You reached out. The reaching out produced a response. The response confirmed that the thing existed. The confirmation let you rest for a while until the next time you needed to confirm it again. Letting the thread go slack required a different thing entirely. It required you to resist the impulse to reach, to sit with the quiet that accumulated when you stopped being the one who maintained the connection, and to not interpret the quiet as failure or loss or abandonment, to trust that a decision you had made about your own emotional labor was the right decision, and to live inside that decision without constantly reevaluating it. She was not good at sitting with quiet that she had produced herself. She was good at sitting with other kinds of quiet, the quiet of a morning, the quiet of a long walk, the quiet of reading. She was good at the quiet that arrived unbidden and stayed for its own reasons. The quiet she had made herself, by stopping something she had been doing, that was a different quality of quiet. It had an active quality to it, a slight charge, like a room after an instrument has stopped being played. She was learning to sit with it. The key, she found, was not to look at the quiet directly, not to measure it or compare it to the sound that had been there before, to let it exist in the peripheral rather than the central field of her attention. She was working on the project. She was going to the book group. She was having lunch with Grace and dinner with her cousin and calling her mother and doing the 100 small ordinary things that constituted her actual daily life. In the middle of all of that, there was the quiet, where the reaching toward Ngozi used to be. She was letting it be there without examining it too carefully. It was becoming, gradually, simply part of the texture of the days. Bissy had sent the group a message about the novel for the next session, asking for initial reactions to the first third. Adaeze wrote back a paragraph, more than she had intended to write, but the thought had a shape to it that required the space. 3 people in the group responded. BC wrote back with a specific counterpoint that made Adaeze rethink one element of what she had said, which she noted and replied to. By the end of the exchange, she had a clearer sense of what she actually thought about the book than she had had at the start of it, which was one of the things a good conversation did. Caroline had emailed about a timeline for the project. Adaeze had replied with a proposed structure. Caroline had responded with a modification that was an improvement, and a question that required an answer she would need to do some additional thinking to provide. She appreciated this. The back and forth of professional work with someone whose input actually made the work better, rather than simply adding a layer to it. Philip had posted a photograph in the group chat. It appeared to be the food from the wedding, captured from a specific angle that made it look more formal than wedding reception food usually looked. His caption was 3 words. The 3 words were not funny on their own. In combination with the angle of the photograph, they produced a very specific observation about the relationship between wedding food and the expectations attached to it. Adaeze had read it 3 times before she got it, and then she had laughed for a while. She was building things. The building did not feel like building from the outside. It felt like an ordinary week in October. Work, a phone call, a book group message, a group chat exchange, a conversation over lunch about something unrelated to everything else. But that was what building usually felt like when it was happening. Not dramatic, just incremental. One thing after another, each one small and real, accumulating into something that had weight. There are things that do not resolve so much as they find their level. Water, when disturbed, does not return to stillness through any decisive action. It simply continues, and the disturbance passes through it, and the surface settles. The water is the same water it was. The surface looks the same surface it was. But something has happened in the moving through, and the settling is not the same as the state before the disturbance began. It is a new stillness, informed by what passed through it. Adeze thought about this on a Sunday morning in the first week of September, as she sat on her balcony with tea, and the morning, and the particular quality of early September light that was different from August, a degree cooler, a degree more slanted, as though the sun had shifted its attention slightly. She had been thinking about what the friendship had been and what it was now, and about whether those were two distinct things or 2 points in the same continuous process. What she had loved about Ngozi was real, she knew that. She had not invented it, and she had not been naive to believe in it. The laughter at the bus park in their second year had been genuine. The long conversations that ran past midnight had been genuine. The 12 years of being known by a person who remembered the specific things about you, those had been genuine. You could not manufacture that retroactively as false, because something difficult came after it. The good things had happened. They had been real. And something else had also been real. The quieter, less convenient truth that the friendship had not been as mutual as she had believed. That the care she had brought to it had not been matched, not in the ways that had mattered most. That she had been, for some portion of the 12 years, working harder to maintain something than the other person was, and had not known it because she had not looked at that possibility directly. Both of those things were true. She was not going to simplify it into one or the other. She was going to let the whole of it be what it was, complicated, and real, and finished. The balcony faced east, and the morning light came at it directly, warm on her face. She held her cup with both hands, and let the warmth of it and the warmth of the light be what they were, which was simply warm and good. She was thinking about the book group's next session. Bisi had sent another message about the novel, and Adeze had responded with a longer thought than she had originally intended to share, and the exchange that followed had been the kind she liked best. Two people with similar minds, but different approaches to the same problem, generating something that neither of them would have found alone. She was thinking about the project with Caroline, and the presentation she had delivered the previous week, which had gone as well as she had hoped, and had produced a specific response from the client that suggested something was beginning to shift in how they understood the problem. She was thinking about her mother, who had called the previous Sunday and stayed on the phone for an hour and a half, and had made Adeze laugh more than once, and had, at some point near the end of the call, said simply, "You sound good, Adeze. You sound like yourself." She had not known what to say to that except yes. Yes, I do. Yes, I am. Her cousin appeared at the balcony door in pajamas, holding a cup of something, squinting at the morning. "You're up early," her cousin said. "It's 9, Adeze said. "That's early." Her cousin settled into the other chair and looked at the street below with the comfortable contempt of someone who had not yet had enough sleep and was aware of it. "What are you thinking about?" "Nothing in particular," Adeze said. Her cousin accepted this, as she accepted most things Adeze said, without pressing, without requiring elaboration, with the easy trust of someone who had lived with her long enough to know when the answer was complete, and when it was incomplete, and which it was this time. They sat in the morning together for a while. Below, the street was doing its Sunday thing, quieter than a weekday, less purposeful than a Saturday, with the particular Sunday quality of a city that is allowed, briefly, to take its time. A man walked a dog. Two women walked together in the unhurried way of people who have nowhere in particular to be, and are enjoying that. A child on a balcony across the way was watching something in the street below, with the focused attention that children gave to things adults had stopped noticing. Adeze thought about the wedding, not with the complicated weight of what had happened in the courtyard. That weight was still there. It had not disappeared. It had simply found its correct proportion in the larger picture of her life. What she thought about was the part after the courtyard, the part where she had walked in. She had not known, standing there with her hand coming back down to her side and the full understanding of the situation sitting in front of her, what was going to happen next. She had not known she would sit in that pew and feel genuinely glad for Kioma. She had not known the table in the ballroom would yield Philip and Caroline, and an evening that turned out to be better than the one she had planned for. She had not known that the absence of her name on the seating list would put her exactly where she needed to be. She had known none of that. She had simply decided to walk through the door. That, she thought, was the most honest version of courage she had ever understood. Not the dramatic kind that films celebrated. Not the kind performed against a backdrop of music and consequence. The small, specific kind. The kind that says, I have every reason to leave, I am going to stay, and then stays, and says nothing about it, and finds a seat, and eats the food, and claps for the right things. She had walked in alone. She had left when she chose to leave. She had sent the messages that needed to be sent. She had received what had been offered in the pharmacy, and acknowledged it for what it was. She had continued her life without drama, without performance, without anything that could be described as a collapse. She was here, now, on a Sunday morning on her balcony, with her tea and her cousin, and the city doing its Sunday things below. She was not waiting for anything. She was not monitoring anything. She was simply here. And here, it turned out, was exactly the right place for her to be. She finished her tea. She would make another cup in a few minutes. She would spend the morning reading, and the afternoon working on the next phase of the project, and the evening, watching whatever terrible thing her cousin had decided they needed to watch. She would call her mother next Sunday. She would go to book group on Wednesday and say what she thought about the novel, and listen to what Bisi thought about it, and find, in the gap between the two readings, something interesting. She would go to Amara's wedding in October, if Philip and Caroline were going to be there, because they would be good company, and because she had apparently earned her place among them by surviving the first one. She would continue. That was the whole of it. That was the plan. She would be exactly who she was, in each moment that presented itself, with as much honesty as she could manage, and as much grace as she had available. And she would be all right. She knew this with the particular certainty of someone who has been tested recently enough to have a current opinion about themselves. Not the theoretical certainty of someone who has not yet been inside anything difficult. The actual, evidence-based certainty of someone who has been inside something difficult and has come out of it, knowing what they are made of. She was made of something that held up. She set her cup down on the small table beside the chair. The morning light moved as the sun continued its work, changing the angle of the shadows below on the street, shifting the light across the balcony floor. Her cousin said, out of nowhere, "That program last night. I keep thinking about it. The one about the inheritance?" "Yes. Do you think she did the right thing?" Adaeze considered. "I think she did the honest thing," she said. "Whether it was the right thing depends on what you're optimizing for." Her cousin made a sound of consideration. "What were you optimizing for?" "I think she was optimizing for being able to look at herself clearly afterward," Adaeze said. Her cousin was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yeah, I think that's right." They sat with that for a little while. The morning continued. The city continued. Adaeze continued inside it, not waiting, not monitoring, not directing any portion of herself toward the maintenance of something that no longer needed her. She was just a woman on a balcony, in the early September morning, holding an empty cup, watching the light move across the street below, and thinking nothing in particular. Which was, she had come to understand, exactly what it felt like to be fully, quietly, correctly herself. She had walked into that church alone. She had sat down. She had stayed. And everything after that had come from the simple, irreducible fact of having done those three things. Walk in. Sit down. Stay. She would carry that with her, not as a wound or as a lesson learned the hard way, or as a story she needed to tell, simply as a thing she now knew about herself, added to the collection of things she knew about herself, a fact she could reach for when the next difficult morning came, as difficult mornings always came, and she needed to remember what she was capable of. She had done it once. She could do it again. She got up from the chair, picked up her cup, and went inside to make more tea. The balcony caught the morning light behind her. The street continued below. And Adaeze, who had walked into a ceremony alone with her back straight and her invitation in her hand, and not broken once, moved through her own kitchen on an early September Sunday, exactly as herself. Entirely herself. She had thought about what to say when she ran into Ngozi in the pharmacy for approximately 2 seconds before saying it. That was not because she had not been thinking about what she might say, eventually, if they encountered each other without the buffer of a screen between them. She had been thinking about it, in the peripheral way she thought about things she was not yet ready to think about directly. She had worked through several versions of what a conversation between them might look like, how it might begin, what she would want it to contain, what she would not want to spend energy on. But in the actual moment, standing in the aisle, with the fluorescent light above them, and the pharmacist moving behind the counter, and the smell of antiseptic and hand lotion that pharmacies had, she had not needed any of the prepared versions. The moment had a clarity to it that made preparation redundant. She had looked at Ngozi, and had seen someone who was tired, and aware of an obligation, and not quite ready to meet it, but closer to readiness than they had been in any of the messages. That was the honest assessment. Not close enough, but closer. The exchange had been short. The things they had said had been the things that could be said in a pharmacy on a Wednesday evening, between two people who were standing in the real shape of what was between them, and were both, in their own ways, navigating that shape in real time, without any of the space that written messages provided. The apology, when it came, had been small and real. Adaeze had received it exactly as she had received it, as a small, real thing. Not as a resolution, because it was not a resolution. Not as the beginning of a return to what they had been, because she did not yet know if there was a return available, or if she would want to make it if there was, but as a first honest act, in a period that had contained very few honest acts from that direction, and as such it was worth receiving and acknowledging. Thank you for saying that. That was the right response. Not, it's fine. Not, I forgive you. Not, we can move past this. None of those things were ready to be said yet, and she was not going to say them before they were ready. She was not going to rush the process, or pretend to a resolution that had not arrived, simply because the moment seemed to call for warmth. What she had said was true. Thank you for saying that. She had meant it as it sounded. A genuine acknowledgement of a genuine act, given its correct weight. Walking out of the pharmacy into the evening air, she had stood at the corner and taken stock of what had just happened, in the way she always took stock, quietly, with her full attention, without drama. Ngozi had said, I did something that was not fair to you. Then, I'm sorry. These were the first honest sentences Ngozi had produced in the entire period since the wedding. They were small, they were late, but they were honest, and she could work with honesty in a way she could not work with anything else that had been offered. What she would do with this, going forward, whether there was anything to do with it, whether anything could be rebuilt from this admission, whether rebuilding was something she wanted, or something that was wise, or something that was even possible, these were not questions for tonight. Tonight she was going to go home and make a hot drink, and sit with her cousin, and let the evening be what the evening was, ordinary and quiet, and hers. She waited for the cab. It came. She got in. On the way home she looked out at the city, moving past, and felt, beneath the complicated layer of everything she was holding, something unexpectedly straightforward. She had handled today well. She had handled the whole of the period since the wedding well. Not perfectly. There was no perfect handling of something like this, but well, with honesty and care, and a consistent attention to what was actually true, rather than what was convenient or comfortable. She was going to be all right. She had said this to herself before, in the days after the wedding, and had known it to be true in a provisional sense. The sense in which you know something because you have decided to trust it, rather than because you have evidence. Now she knew it in a different way, in the evidential way, in the way that comes from having moved through something difficult for 5 weeks, and still being entirely, recognizably, intact. She was going to be all right. She was, she thought, already mostly all right.